Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old farmhouses do that, groan and crack as temperatures drop, their bones contracting in the October cold. The realtor had warned me about the quirks of the place: 200-year-old timber frames, original floorboards in half the rooms, a wood stove heating system that belonged in a museum. But the price was right, and I needed the isolation, needed to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant hum of other lives pressing against mine. Aroostook County stretched around the property like a vast, indifferent mouth. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a dirt road that turned to soup when it rained. Perfect. I could spend the autumn months stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, and not thinking about everything I'd left behind. The living room became my base of operations. I set up my sleeping bag near the brick fireplace. Though I never used it, all the heat came from below, rising through an ornate iron grate set into the floor. The pattern was beautiful in a severe Victorian way. Interlocking diamonds and fleur-de-lis, oxidized to a dull pewter. Through the gaps, I could see the warm glow of the wood stove in the basement, and if I pressed my face close to the metal, I could smell ash and burning oak. On the third night, the wind picked up around midnight. I'd been lying awake, watching shadows dance across the ceiling as tree branches scraped the windows. That's when I heard it, a metallic clang from the grate, sharp and deliberate. Then another. Clang, clang. Like someone striking iron with purpose, with rhythm. My first thought was thermal expansion. Metal contracts when it cools, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunset. But the sound came at regular intervals, almost patient. I counted 4 seconds between each clang, too consistent for random physics. I lay there for 20 minutes listening. The wind howled through the eaves, and somewhere in the house a shutter banged loose. Normal sounds, explainable sounds. But underneath it all, that steady percussion continued. Clang, clang, clang. Eventually, exhaustion won. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and let the rhythm carry me into uneasy dreams. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it. I spent 14 hours sanding the banister until my arms ached and sawdust coated my lungs. Physical labor had always been good for quieting the mind. By evening, I was too tired to do anything but heat up a can of soup on the camp stove and collapse into my sleeping bag. But that night, I stayed awake. The wind came again, stronger this time, rattling the window panes in their frames, and right on schedule, as if it had been waiting for darkness to fall completely. Clang, clang. I sat up, heart hammering. The grate gleamed dully in the moonlight streaming through the bare windows. From my angle, I couldn't see anything moving, but the sound was definitely coming from there, or from below it. Clang, clang. I grabbed my LED lantern and approached the grate slowly, the way you might approach a sleeping dog you're not sure about. The metal was warm under my palm. The stove must have been banked pretty well to still be putting out heat. I crouched down, shining the light through the decorative ironwork. The basement below was a cavern of shadows. The wood stove squatted against the far wall, a squat iron beast with chrome trim around its doors. Firewood was stacked neatly beside it. Nothing moved down there. Nothing I could see. Clang. The sound came again, and this time I felt it through the grate. A vibration that traveled up my arm. Something had struck the metal from below. I should have left it alone, should have convinced myself it was just the old heating system doing what old heating systems do. But I'd spent the last 6 months not trusting my own judgment, second-guessing every instinct, and I was tired of being uncertain. I needed to know. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, the kind built when people were smaller and less concerned with building codes. My lantern threw wild shadows as I descended, and the temperature rose with each step. By the time I reached the bottom, sweat was prickling along my spine despite the October chill. The stove radiated heat like a small sun. Its doors were closed, the way I'd left them before bed. The iron poker hung from its hook on the wall, undisturbed. Everything was exactly as it should be. I stood there for a full minute, listening. The house creaked above me. The stove ticked as metal expanded. Normal sounds. I was turning to go back upstairs when I heard it again, but different this time. Not the clang of metal on metal, but a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My lantern beam swung toward the noise. The poker was moving, not swaying, not rattling from vibration, moving deliberately, horizontally, as if invisible hands were sliding it across the brick wall. It scratched against the mortar, a sound that set my teeth on edge. I opened my mouth to shout, "Who's there?" or stop, or something equally useless. But before I could make a sound, the poker fell. It clattered to the floor and lay still. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too fast, could hear my pulse throbbing in my ears. But underneath that, I became aware of something else, a presence. Not a sound exactly, but the sense that I was no longer alone, that something was sharing this basement space with me, something that had been here long before I arrived and would be here long after I left. The stove doors swung open, both of them simultaneously, their hinges shrieking. The fire inside had burned down to coals, but they still glowed orange hot, casting a hellish light across the basement floor. And in that light, I saw it. Footprints. Soot marks on the concrete, clear as day. They started at the base of the stove. No, they started inside the stove, emerging from the coals themselves, and tracked across the floor toward the stairs, toward me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they ended directly beneath the grate, directly beneath the spot where I'd been sleeping for 3 nights. My voice cracked when I finally found it. "Who's there?" The words echoed in the confined space, mocking in their inadequacy. Who asks polite questions of footprints that emerge from fire? Nothing answered. The basement remained still except for the dancing shadows cast by the open stove. But I could feel it now, a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, a wrongness that made my skin crawl and my stomach clench. I backed toward the stairs, not willing to turn my back on the room. My heel caught on the bottom step and I nearly fell, catching myself on the rough wooden railing. The splinters biting into my palm felt real, solid, an anchor to the physical world that was rapidly feeling less reliable. I took the stairs 2 at a time. Back in the living room, I stood over the grate, shining my light down into the basement I'd just fled. The stove doors were closed again. The poker hung on its hook. The floor was clean, no footprints, no soot marks, nothing. I spent the rest of that night sitting with my back against the wall, watching the grate. It didn't make another sound. As dawn light began filtering through the eastern windows, turning everything gray and normal, I wondered if I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. If the isolation was already getting to me, my mind conjuring threats to fill the void of human contact. But when I finally worked up the courage to approach the grate again, to crouch down and examine it in the morning light, I found something that stopped my breath. Caught in one of the iron scrollwork curves was a single thread of fabric. Old, colorless with age, but unmistakably real. And in the dust on the floor around the grate, barely visible unless you were looking for them, were small displacement marks. Not quite footprints, more like the ghost of footprints, the faintest impression that something had stood there. Recently, I told myself I'd pack up that day, throw my tools and sleeping bag in the truck and drive back to civilization, find an apartment with thin walls and neighbors who complained about noise, surround myself with the pressing comfort of other human lives. But I didn't leave. Instead, I spent the day researching. The historical society in the nearest town had spotty records, but what they had made my skin prickle. The farmhouse had stood since 1823. 7 families had lived here over the centuries. 3 of those families had left suddenly, mid-renovation, their belongings still in place. The county had seized the property for unpaid taxes twice. No one had ever died here. The clerk was very clear about that, as if people always asked. But in 1847, during the hungriest part of winter, a man had vanished from the property, just disappeared one February night, leaving his wife and the house he'd been repairing. They'd found his tools arranged neatly in the basement next to the wood stove, found the poker lying on the floor, though he'd always hung it properly. They never found him. That night, I didn't set up my sleeping bag near the grate. I dragged it to the far corner of the room, as far from that square of iron as I could get. I kept my lantern on, even though the batteries wouldn't last more than a few hours. The wind came again. Of course it did. And with it, the clanging. But this time, I heard something else. Something underneath the metallic rhythm that made my throat tight and my hands shake. Scratching. Like fingernails on metal. Like someone trying to claw their way up from below. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and lay there, listening to my own panicked breathing, listening to the sounds from the grate, listening to the house settle around me. At some point, I must have slept because I jolted awake to gray dawn light and silence. When I looked across the room, my breath caught. The grate was slightly displaced, just an inch or two, as if something had pushed up from below, and scattered across the floor, in a trail leading from the iron square to where I now slept, were fresh soot marks, footprints, getting closer. I'm writing this now in my truck, parked at a rest stop 3 hours south of the property. I haven't decided if I'm going back. The rational part of my brain insists there's an explanation. Shifting foundations, animals in the basement, my own isolation-addled mind playing tricks. But I can still feel it. That presence in the dark below the grate. That patient, persistent something that emerges when the wind blows and the temperature drops. And I keep thinking about the man who vanished in 1847. About his tools, neatly arranged. About the poker on the floor. About how they never found him, even though the winter was brutal that year, and the nearest town was miles away through snow that stood waist deep. I keep thinking about those footprints, starting from nothing and ending beneath my bed. About how close they'd gotten by that last morning. About how much closer they might be tonight if I go back. The house is still mine, legally. The renovations are half finished. My tools are still in the living room, probably arranged neatly by now, waiting for me to return. Something is waiting. I can feel it. Even here. 3 hours and 90 miles away. A cold certainty that settles into my bones like winter frost. That whatever is in that basement, whatever lives beneath that grate, it isn't finished with me yet. The question I can't answer. The one that keeps me sitting in this truck, engine idling, unable to decide whether to drive forward or back, is whether it was ever really there at all. Whether the footprints and the sounds and the presence were anything more than my own mind, finally cracking under the weight of isolation I'd sought out so eagerly. Whether the only thing haunting that farmhouse is me. I watch the sun climb higher in the October sky, and know that by tonight, darkness will fall again. The wind will blow, and somewhere in Aroostook County, in a basement beneath an iron grate, something will wake. Waiting to see if I come back, waiting to finish what it started. Story 2. The fluorescent lights in the server room hummed their eternal drone, a sound I'd grown so accustomed to that silence felt wrong now. 3 months had passed since they'd cleared out Davidson's desk, boxing up his personal effects while I watched from my cubicle, pretending to troubleshoot a network issue that didn't exist. Nobody talked about what happened. The official line was medical leave. But the way HR had swept through his workspace with the efficiency of crime scene cleaners told a different story. I should have decommissioned his workstation immediately. Best practices demanded it. But there's a superstition among IT folks about machines that belong to the departed. Not departed in the permanent sense, I kept telling myself, just gone. We leave them untouched for a while, like digital shrines. At least, that's what I told myself when I kept finding excuses not to wipe his drive. The contract issue forced my hand. A client needed documentation that Davidson had been handling, and after 2 weeks of searching through our shared drives and coming up empty, I had no choice but to power up his machine. The tower sat exactly where he'd left it, gathering dust in the corner of what was now a storage area, surrounded by broken office chairs and boxes of outdated hardware. The power button clicked under my thumb with a sound that seemed too loud in the empty corridor. The machine wheezed to life, fans rattling like something organic struggling to breathe. I'd built this particular workstation myself 2 years ago, knew every component, every cable route. Yet standing there in the half-light of the emergency exit sign, it felt foreign, almost hostile. The login screen appeared. I entered my admin credentials, expecting the usual resistance: expired password prompts, security updates, the digital detritus of a machine left dormant. Instead, it logged in immediately, desktop loading with unsettling smoothness. Davidson's wallpaper stared back at me, a stock image of mountains that we'd all made fun of for its generic corporate blandness. I started searching for the contract files, clicking through folders with names like Q3 Proposals and Client Archive. The mechanical clatter of the hard drive was the only sound in the corridor. Then my radio crackled. "Hey, did you just send me something?" Leslie from reception, her voice tinny through the cheap handheld we all carried. I thumbed the transmit button. "Negative. I'm in the back corridor, haven't touched the network." A pause, longer than comfortable. That's weird. I just got a notification from Davidson's account. Just a blank message window. My hand froze on the mouse. That's impossible. His credentials were revoked months ago. I did it myself the day after. I caught myself. The day after he left. Well, it's showing his name and everything. No text, just empty. Kinda creepy, actually. I told her I'd look into it and signed off, but my attention was already pulled to the screen in front of me. The messaging application wasn't even open. I checked the system tray, the task manager, running processes. Nothing. No active sessions. No network activity beyond the standard background chatter of a Windows machine on a domain. I should have shut it down then. Should have pulled the plug and reported an anomaly in our authentication system. Instead, I kept digging, pulled by that particular form of professional pride that makes IT people chase ghosts in the machine. The event logs told a story that made the corridor feel colder. Authentication attempts, successful ones, going back weeks. All from this machine, all under Davidson's credentials. Credentials that existed in our system only as a deactivated shell, a digital tombstone marked "Disabled account, do not remove." The timestamps clustered around specific times: 2:47 a.m., 3:12 a.m., 4:33 a.m. Always the early morning hours, always when the building stood empty except for the security guard making his rounds on the ground floor. But what made my throat tighten was the pattern I noticed when I cross-referenced with our access control logs. These sessions only occurred on nights when someone had worked late. The machine would spring to life in those dead hours after the last person left, but before dawn broke. I pulled up our asset database, searching for the hardware ID. The record showed the machine as decommissioned, hardware failure, disposed Q2. I'd tagged it myself, slapped a red scrap label on the case before wheeling it to the pile of dead equipment we kept before the quarterly e-waste pickup. Except here it was, running, connected to our network, and according to the logs, it had never stopped. My radio remained silent, but I could feel its weight on my hip, a presence waiting to crackle to life. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with those terrible industrial doors that never quite closed all the way, leaving dark gaps that seemed wider now, deeper. The HVAC system kicked on somewhere distant, and the sound traveled through the ductwork like something breathing. I reached for the power button, ready to end this, but the screen flickered. Not a full refresh, just a momentary distortion, like heat shimmer across the display. The cursor moved. Not far, just a small drift across the desktop, perfectly diagonal, as if someone had nudged the mouse. My hands were in my lap. The mouse sat undisturbed on the desk. The rational part of my brain, the part trained to troubleshoot, to find logical explanations, offered up possibilities. Wireless interference, a stuck pixel creating the illusion of movement. Maybe even a remote session I'd somehow missed in the logs. But that rational voice grew quieter with each passing second, drowned out by the thundering of my pulse in my ears. The messaging application opened. No click, no keystroke, just suddenly there, filling the screen with its corporate blue interface. The buddy list populated, showing everyone currently logged in. 7 people, scattered throughout the building, all of them working late on various projects. Then an 8th name appeared, Davidson. Status, available. I grabbed my radio. Leslie, are you still at reception? Static, then her voice uncertain. Yeah, still here. Where else would I be? Is anyone with you? No, why? You're starting to freak me out. Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone until I get there. I didn't wait for her response. The application was opening chat windows now, rapid fire, one after another, all of them blank. No text, no indicators that anything was being typed. Just empty white rectangles appearing on screen, each one labeled with the name of someone working alone somewhere in the building. My finger hovered over the power button, but I couldn't press it. Something held me there, a morbid need to understand what I was witnessing. The windows multiplied, filling the screen in a cascade of emptiness. Each one a silent reaching out to someone isolated in their workspace, accompanied by the soft alert chime that our messaging system used. Through the thin walls, I could hear those chimes echoing from other parts of the building. A distant melody of notification sounds, all triggered simultaneously, all announcing messages that contained nothing. My radio exploded with voices. Leslie demanding to know what was happening. Thompson from accounting, asking why Davidson was messaging him. Chen from HR, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear, saying she'd just heard footsteps in the corridor outside her office. But when she looked, no one was there. The screen went black, not powered off, just displaying pure black, the backlight still glowing faintly. Then text appeared, white letters directly in the center. Are you alone? I yanked the power cable from the wall. The screen died instantly, fans spooling down with a descending whine. The tower's LED lights faded to black. I stood there, breathing hard, watching the dead machine as if it might spring back to life on its own. My radio crackled with overlapping voices, everyone talking at once, demanding explanations, reporting strange occurrences. Messages from deactivated accounts, phantom footsteps, the feeling of being watched from empty doorways. I forced myself to think like a technician. Network breach. Had to be. Some kind of sophisticated attack exploiting Davidson's old credentials, maybe malware he'd inadvertently installed before he left. The timing was coincidence. The empty messages a glitch in the payload delivery. The text on the screen, probably triggered by some script detecting the admin login. But even as I constructed this framework of rationality, I felt it crumbling. Because I'd checked the logs, seen the pattern extending back weeks before I'd ever touched that machine. Because I'd tagged that hardware as destroyed, watched it get loaded onto the e-waste pallet myself, yet here it stood, warm and alive, its hard drive chattering with secrets in the dark. I left the machine there and went to reception, gathering everyone still in the building to the main conference room. 9 people, counting myself, all of them visibly rattled. I explained it as a security breach, outlined the steps we'd take to contain it, spoke with the calm authority expected of someone in my position. They wanted to believe me. I wanted to believe myself. We locked down the network, changed everyone's passwords, documented the incident for Monday's meeting with management. By midnight, everyone had gone home, and I sat alone in the server room, staring at security feeds from cameras positioned throughout the building. The storage corridor appeared on monitor 3, grainy night vision green rendering everything in shades of decay. The desk where Davidson's machine sat remained visible in the frame's lower right corner. As I watched, the power LED on the tower's case flickered on. The machine was booting up, without anyone there, without being plugged in. I pulled up the network logs on my laptop. Authentication request from Davidson's account, timestamp 2:47 a.m., accepted, session active. Through the building's PA system, which I had not touched, a single soft chime played. The messaging alert sound, echoing through empty corridors and dark offices. My phone buzzed, a notification from our messaging system. One new message, from Davidson's account. I opened it with trembling fingers. The message was blank. But as I stared at the empty white space on my screen, I became aware of something else. A presence, undefined and sourceless. Like the moment you realize you're not alone in a room you thought was empty. The server room's temperature hadn't changed. The sounds remained constant, yet something felt fundamentally different. The camera feed from the corridor showed nothing unusual. The machine sat there, LED glowing steady, no other movement visible. But I noticed something I'd missed before. In the reflection on the dark window behind the desk, there was a shape. Indistinct, barely visible, but present. A silhouette that suggested a person standing in a space where the camera showed nothing. I switched to the camera that should have captured that angle directly. Empty corridor. Switched back to the first feed. The reflection remained, clearer now, as if whatever cast it had moved closer to the glass. My laptop chimed. Another message. This time, text appeared. "Why did you leave me in the dark?" I slammed the laptop shut, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The server room's lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. In that momentary darkness, I swore I heard the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. The rational explanations I'd constructed throughout the evening dissolved like sugar in water. This wasn't malware. This wasn't a breach. This was something else entirely. Something that had latched onto Davidson's digital presence and now existed in the spaces between electrons and code. Or maybe, and this thought was somehow worse, maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the past months, the unspoken knowledge of what had really happened to Davidson, had finally cracked something essential in my psyche. Maybe I was sitting alone in this humming room, hallucinating threats that existed only in my own deteriorating mental landscape. I opened the laptop again. The message was gone, replaced by my normal desktop. The network logs showed no activity from Davidson's account. The security feed displayed an empty corridor with no impossible reflections. But on my desk, next to my cold coffee and scattered notes, sat something that hadn't been there before. A red label peeling at the edges, with my handwriting clearly visible. Scrap, do not boot. The server room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the hum of the machines taking on a rhythm that sounded almost like words. I tried to convince myself I'd brought the label in myself, that I'd peeled it off the machine earlier and forgotten. But I could still see it in my mind's eye, affixed to the tower's case in the corridor, untouched. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence with a burst of static. No voice followed, just empty air, the open channel breathing into the room. I reached for it slowly, brought it close to my ear. In the background noise, beneath the electronic hiss, I thought I could hear something. A whisper, too faint to make out words, but carrying a tone that raised the hair on my arms. I switched off the radio and sat in the artificial daylight of the server room, surrounded by machines that suddenly felt less like tools and more like windows, portals to spaces where the rules governing reality grew thin and negotiable. The question Davidson's machine had asked echoed in my mind. Are you alone? Sitting there at 3 a.m., surrounded by humming servers and blinking lights, I realized I couldn't answer that question anymore. Couldn't say with certainty what was real and what my mind had fabricated from fear and exhaustion. Couldn't even be sure that the messages I'd seen had actually appeared on any screen at all. What I knew was this: Davidson wasn't coming back. His machine shouldn't have been there, shouldn't have been functioning, yet it was. And somewhere in the building, or in my head, I couldn't tell anymore, something was reaching out through the network, sending messages to anyone who found themselves alone. The sun would rise in a few hours. Daylight would bring other people, normal conversations, the mundane rhythm of office life. I could pretend this night hadn't happened, could wipe the logs and disable Davidson's account permanently and tell myself it was over. But I knew, whether through madness or genuine horror, that I'd never work late alone again, that I'd never look at an empty corridor the same way, that every time I powered on a computer, I'd wonder what might be waiting on the other side of the screen, watching through the dark glass, sending messages into the void and hoping for an answer. The laptop chimed one last time. I didn't open it. I just sat there, listening to the servers breathe, waiting for morning, and trying not to think about the soft sound of typing that seemed to be coming from the corridor where no one should be. Story 3. The first thing I remember is the cold. Not the gradual awareness of temperature that comes with waking, but a sudden, violent assault of frigid air that shocked every nerve ending in my body awake at once. My hand was on the door handle, the driver's side door wide open, and the February night was pouring into the car like water into a sinking ship. The dashboard clock glowed 3:47 a.m. in pale blue numerals that seemed too bright, too sharp, as if someone had turned up the contrast on reality itself. I sat there, breath-forming clouds in the suddenly Arctic interior, trying to piece together how I'd gotten from the warm cocoon of sleep to this moment of crystalline awareness. The last clear memory was pulling into the garage after leaving Riley's Tavern, my head swimming with one too many whiskeys and the peculiar melancholy that settles over you when you drink alone on a Thursday night. I'd meant to go straight inside, but the house had felt too empty, too quiet, so I'd stayed in the car with the heat running and the radio playing something low and forgettable. The engine was still running. I could hear it idling beneath me, a familiar purr that should have been comforting, but instead made my stomach clench with an undefined dread. Through the windshield, the closed garage door stared back at me like a blank face, and something about that bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Then I noticed the radio. The volume knob was turned all the way down. I could see the position clearly in the dashboard lights, but I could still hear music, faint, distant, like it was coming from another room or another time. The melody was familiar in that maddening way where you know you've heard something before but can't place it. Some old song from childhood, maybe, or a commercial jingle that had burrowed into the subconscious decades ago. My hand moved to turn off the ignition, and that's when I saw my fingers trembling. Not the normal shakiness of someone who'd had a few drinks and woken up disoriented, but a deep, visceral tremor that started somewhere in my bones and radiated outward. I closed my hand into a fist, watching the knuckles go white, and forced myself to think. Something had woken me. Something loud enough and urgent enough to jolt me from whatever depth of sleep I'd fallen into. I strained to remember, reaching back through the fog, and found only fragments. Warmth, darkness, and then the voice. It came back to me in a rush that made my skin prickle. A voice erupting from the speakers, distorted and enormous, shouting a single word that had torn through my consciousness like a thunderclap. Wake up. Not a gentle suggestion from a concerned friend, but a command delivered with desperate intensity, as if whoever was speaking knew they had only seconds to reach me. And then, impossibly, the dashboard had gone dark, every light extinguishing simultaneously, before flickering back to life. I told myself it had been a dream, some anxiety-fueled nightmare about oversleeping or missing something important, manifesting in that strange twilight space between consciousness and oblivion. The radio had probably hit a pocket of static or picked up some late-night evangelist's broadcast, and my half-asleep brain had interpreted it as something more sinister than it was. But dreams don't leave you gasping in the cold with your car door open and no memory of opening it. I finally killed the engine and stepped out onto the garage floor. The concrete was icy beneath my shoes, cold enough that I could feel it through the soles. The garage was exactly as I'd left it, cluttered with the accumulated debris of solitary living, tools hanging on pegboards, cardboard boxes stacked against the walls containing things I'd convinced myself I might need someday. My workbench sat in the corner, dust-covered and abandoned. Nothing was out of place. Nothing except the car. I walked around to the front, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name, and froze. The hood was closed, latched properly, just as it should be. But scattered across the dark metal surface, clearly visible in the overhead fluorescent light, was a fine layer of dust, the kind that accumulates over days or weeks in an enclosed space. And pressed into that dust were handprints. They weren't mine. I knew that immediately, and with absolute certainty. These prints were larger, the fingers longer and more widely spaced than my own. They were positioned as if someone had been standing in front of the car, leaning forward with both palms flat against the hood, pressing down with enough force to leave clear impressions in the accumulated grime. My first rational thought was that someone had been in the garage. A break-in, maybe, or a confused neighbor. But the side door was locked from the inside. I could see the deadbolt engaged from where I stood, and the garage door hadn't been opened since I'd pulled in hours earlier. The seal was intact, that rubber strip along the bottom pressed tight against the concrete floor. I reached out slowly, extending my own hand toward the hood, stopping just short of touching it. The prints seemed to pulse with an almost tangible presence, like they were still warm from the contact. I couldn't bring myself to place my hand over them, to see how poorly the comparison would line up. The house suddenly felt very far away, even though the door to the kitchen was less than 10 feet behind me. I backed away from the car, eyes never leaving those handprints, and tried to construct some explanation that didn't involve impossible things happening in locked garages. Maybe they'd been there for days and I simply hadn't noticed. Maybe they were my own prints from some forgotten maintenance task, distorted by perspective or memory. Maybe. But I knew I was lying to myself. Inside the house, I locked every door and checked every window twice. The familiar rooms felt wrong, like someone had moved everything an inch to the left while I wasn't paying attention. Shadows fell at slightly incorrect angles. The hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud in the silent kitchen. I made coffee, even though it was nearly 4 in the morning, just to have something to do with my hands, and sat at the kitchen table watching the dark square of the window above the sink. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again. Wake up, reverberating through my skull with that strange, distorted quality. Not mechanical, not quite human either. Something in between, or something else entirely. And beneath it, almost subliminal, that distant music continuing to play even though the radio had been off, even though I was inside with walls and doors between me and the garage. When dawn finally bled gray light across the horizon, I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Things always seemed less threatening in daylight. Even winter daylight filtered through overcast skies. I drank the last of my coffee, now cold and bitter, and decided to examine the car again with fresh eyes and clearer thinking. The garage felt different in the morning, not safer exactly, but less oppressively strange. I'd left the overhead light on all night, and now it seemed unnecessary, washing everything in harsh fluorescence. The car sat where I'd left it, hood still marked with those impossible handprints, except they weren't handprints anymore. I stood staring for a full minute, my tired brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The dust was still there. I could see it coating the hood in an uneven layer, but the prints were gone. Not wiped away or smudged, but simply absent, as if they'd never existed at all. The surface showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence that anyone or anything had touched it recently. I ran my own hand across the hood, feeling the grit beneath my palm, and pulled it back to examine the mark I'd made. It was clear, distinct, exactly what you'd expect from pressing your hand into dust. I wiped it away with my sleeve, leaving a clean streak in the grime, then stepped back to look at the whole picture. No other marks, no prints, nothing. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through engineering school and 15 years of solving concrete, measurable problems, suggested carbon monoxide poisoning. It would explain the disorientation, the hallucinations, the gaps in memory. Sitting in a closed garage with the engine running, even briefly, could flood the space with enough CO to cause symptoms. The voice could have been my own subconscious recognizing the danger, trying to force me awake before it was too late. It made sense. It was logical. It was probably true. But it didn't explain why I could still hear the music. Faint, barely perceptible, but there, that same melody drifting through the air like smoke. I turned slowly, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The garage, the house, the walls themselves. When I focused on it directly, it faded to nothing. When I let my attention drift, it crept back in. I spent the next 3 days trying to convince myself I was fine. I bought a carbon monoxide detector and mounted it in the garage. The readings came back normal. I had the furnace checked, the water heater inspected. Everything was functioning properly. I even made an appointment with my doctor, though I canceled it twice before finally keeping it, unable to articulate exactly what was wrong. He ran tests, blood work, neurological exam, questions about stress and sleep patterns. Everything came back normal. He suggested I was probably just exhausted, maybe a little depressed, understandable for someone living alone, working too much, drinking a little too much. He wrote me a prescription for sleep aids that I filled but never took. Because every night when I parked in the garage and killed the engine, I sat there in the silence listening, waiting. The memory of that voice had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, and I couldn't stop probing the wound. Sometimes I'd turn the radio on just to fill the space, but I always turned it off again, unnerved by how the static seemed to shape itself into almost words. The handprints never came back, but other things did. Small things at first. The driver's seat would be adjusted differently than I'd left it, moved forward or back by just an inch or two. The rearview mirror would be angled wrong. I'd find the car unlocked in the morning, even though I was certain, absolutely certain, I'd locked it the night before. Once, I discovered all 4 windows rolled down halfway, even though it had rained during the night and the interior was soaked. I told myself I was doing these things in my sleep. Sleepwalking was a documented phenomenon. People could do complex tasks while not fully conscious. It didn't matter that I'd never sleepwalked before in my life, or that I was now locking my bedroom door from the inside at night, or that the growing pile of empty whiskey bottles in the recycling bin was getting harder to ignore. Then came the night I woke up in the car again. Not in the garage this time. In the driveway, engine off, keys in my lap. The first light of dawn turning the sky from black to gray. I was dressed, shoes on, coat buttoned. The rational explanation was obvious. I'd gotten up, gotten dressed, and gone outside for some reason I couldn't remember. Maybe I'd been planning to drive somewhere. Maybe I'd heard a noise. But my bedroom door had been locked from the inside. I found it that way when I finally went back into the house, the key sitting on my nightstand exactly where I'd left it. And my shoes, the ones I was wearing, were caked with mud, even though the ground was frozen solid and had been for weeks. I stopped parking in the garage after that, started leaving the car in the driveway, sometimes even on the street. It didn't matter. Whatever was happening followed me anyway, or had already made its home inside my head, which amounted to the same thing. The music got louder, not dramatically, but incrementally, like someone was slowly turning up a volume knob that didn't exist. I could hear it during the day now, at work, in restaurants, in the grocery store. That same melody, endlessly looping, just beneath the threshold of conscious hearing. When I tried to describe it to anyone, the words dissolved before I could form them, and I'd end up standing there with my mouth open, reaching for something I couldn't articulate. I started researching online late at night, falling down rabbit holes of articles about auditory hallucinations, about people who heard phantom music, or voices after strokes or drug reactions or simple stress. I read about carbon monoxide poisoning, about how it could cause delayed neurological effects weeks or months after exposure. I read about sleep deprivation and its effects on perception, about how the brain starts to malfunction when denied proper rest for long enough. None of it felt quite right. None of it matched the specificity of what I was experiencing. 3 weeks after that first night, I found myself back in the garage. I hadn't consciously decided to go there. It was past midnight and I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the music that wouldn't stop. But suddenly I was standing in the cold space, barefoot on the concrete, looking at the car. The hood was warm. I placed my palm flat against it and felt the heat radiating through the metal, unmistakable and impossible. The engine hadn't been running in hours. The garage was freezing, my breath visible in the still air. But the hood was warm, as if someone had just driven the car and parked it moments ago. I opened the driver's side door and sat down, my hands automatically going to the steering wheel. The leather was warm too, body temperature warm, like someone had been gripping it tightly. The seat was adjusted to my position exactly, the mirrors perfectly aligned. Everything was as it should be. except for the wrongness that permeated the entire space like a smell I couldn't place. The radio was on, not playing anything, just turned on, the display glowing softly in the darkness. The volume was at 0, but I could hear it anyway. That music, clearer now than it had ever been. I recognized it suddenly, though I couldn't have said what it was or where I'd heard it before. A song about warning someone, about trying to reach them before it was too late. My hand moved to the volume knob. I don't remember deciding to turn it, but my fingers were already there, already rotating it clockwise. The music swelled, filling the car, no longer distant or muffled but present and immediate, and beneath it, just barely audible, a voice, my voice, saying words I couldn't understand, speaking urgently about something I couldn't remember. The recording, if that's what it was, seemed to skip and stutter, cutting in and out like a scratched CD, and every time it cut, the gaps were filled with that desperate command, "Wake up, wake up, wake up." I sat there listening, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the voice tried to tell me something important, something about the night I'd fallen asleep, something about what had almost happened, or what had happened, or what was still happening. The handprints appeared on the hood again, this time from the inside. I watched them form in the condensation on the windshield. 2 large handprints, palms pressed flat against the glass from the exterior, fingers splayed wide, pressing in, trying to reach something, trying to reach me. And in that moment, sitting in the warm car in the cold garage with my own voice repeating instructions I couldn't hear, and handprints that shouldn't exist blooming on the glass before me, I understood something terrible. I didn't know if I'd ever really woken up at all. The voice on the radio was still shouting, the music was still playing, the handprints were still there, larger than mine, pressing harder now. And somewhere, in some version of this moment I couldn't quite reach, I was still sleeping in that car with the garage door closed and the engine running, while something or someone stood outside in the cold, desperately trying to wake me before it was too late. Or maybe I was the one standing outside, looking in, watching myself suffocate, and I'd been screaming myself hoarse for weeks trying to reach the version of me that was trapped inside. The dashboard lights flickered, the radio cut to static, the handprints faded, and I sat there, awake or asleep or something else entirely, unable to tell the difference anymore, listening to the melody that wouldn't stop and waiting for an answer that would never come. Story 4. The crack echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, sharp and final, and I knew immediately that something had gone wrong in the forensics building. I'd been night supervisor at Harrington College for 3 years, long enough to distinguish between the settling groans of century-old naval architecture and the sounds that demanded immediate attention. This was the latter. The building had once served as an ordnance testing facility during the First World War, back when the entire campus was a functioning naval arsenal. Most people found that history charming in daylight. At 2:47 a.m., surrounded by laboratories filled with decomposition specimens and bone analysis equipment, the charm wore thin. The smell hit me before I reached the 3rd floor. Burnt meat. Not the acrid chemical stink of an electrical fire, but organic, unmistakable. I'd worked a summer job at a rendering plant in my 20s, and that scent had branded itself into my memory. This was the same, but somehow wronger, carrying an undertone of something sweet and rotten that made my throat constrict. The fluorescent lights in the corridor flickered in that particular rhythm that suggested failing ballasts rather than power surges. I kept my flashlight off, preferring to let my eyes adjust to the sickly green wash of emergency lighting. The cubicle lab door stood slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered checking it locked during my 1 a.m. round. The plastic nameplate beside it read, "Thermal Analysis and Material Testing," though I'd been told the equipment hadn't been operational for months, waiting on some delayed parts shipment. I pushed the door wider with my elbow, keeping my hands free. The smell intensified, coating the back of my tongue with phantom grease. Inside, the cubicles stood in their usual grid pattern, each workstation separated by shoulder-high partitions. Nothing seemed disturbed. The equipment hummed its normal baseline frequency, but the smell persisted, thick enough to taste, and beneath it I detected something else. Ozone, like the air after lightning strikes too close. The thermal chamber sat in the back corner, a hulking stainless steel cylinder that looked more like a submarine component than laboratory equipment. Its door hung open. I knew for a fact it had been closed and secured during my earlier round because I'd tested it specifically. The facilities director had been paranoid about students accessing it unsupervised. The interior glowed faintly, residual heat still radiating from whatever had been running inside. I didn't see anyone. No technician pulling an unauthorized late shift. No student conducting unsanctioned experiments. Just the empty chamber, that pervasive smell, and the growing certainty that I was standing in the aftermath of something I couldn't name. My radio crackled, not with a voice, but with a burst of static that formed almost patterns in the white noise. I thumbed the talk button to call dispatch, but before I could speak, the lights throughout the building cut out entirely. Total darkness lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the backup system engaged, bathing everything in that sickly emergency glow. In that brief interval of blackness, I heard breathing that wasn't mine, steady, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deeper in the room. I pulled the door shut behind me and engaged the deadbolt, then used my master key to throw the secondary lock, a redundant security measure installed after a theft incident 2 years prior. The building's circuit breakers sat in the basement mechanical room, and my training said to secure the scene before cutting power. Standard procedure for hazmat situations, and that smell definitely qualified. The breaker panel responded as expected, the heavy switches thunking into the off position with satisfying solidity. The building fell into deeper darkness, relieved only by the red exit signs running on their own battery backup. I called maintenance from the emergency phone in the basement, a hardwired landline that predated the college's conversion to VoIP systems. The phone rang 4 times before connecting, but no one spoke on the other end. Just silence, the kind that sounds occupied rather than empty, as though someone had picked up and was simply listening. I identified myself and gave my location, requesting immediate assistance with a possible equipment malfunction in forensics. The silence persisted for another moment, then the line went dead with a soft click. The maintenance log would later show no record of my call. What it did show was an incoming call at 2:51 a.m. from extension 4731, a number that had been disconnected in 1963 when the Navy decommissioned the arsenal and sold the property to the college. That extension had originally served the ordnance testing office, the very room that now housed the thermal analysis lab. I made my way back upstairs in the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom in narrow slices. The smell had faded somewhat, or perhaps my olfactory system had simply capitulated, unable to process the assault any longer. I stood outside the locked door, my key ring heavy in my hand, and tried to construct a rational sequence of events that would explain everything I'd experienced. Faulty equipment creating unusual odors. Plausible. Thermal chamber activating due to a malfunction, concerning but explicable. The strange phone call, odd but computer systems glitch. The sounds in the darkness, my own breathing echoing off hard surfaces, maybe exaggerated by adrenaline and an overactive imagination. But then why did my hands shake as I raised the key to the lock? I hesitated, key hovering before the deadbolt, and noticed something I hadn't registered before. The lock cylinder sat slightly proud of its housing, as though someone had been pulling on the door from inside. Fresh scratches marred the brushed steel around the keyhole, thin lines that caught my flashlight beam and threw it back in sharp glints. The key slid home with more resistance than usual. I applied pressure to turn it, but the mechanism refused to budge. I tried again, wiggling the key, checking that I had the right one. The yellow tag marked clearly with Forensics Thermal Lab Secondary. The lock remained stubbornly engaged. Then, without any conscious decision on my part, I reversed my grip and turned the key counterclockwise instead. The deadbolt slid back with a smooth, oiled click that it definitely hadn't made when I'd locked it an hour earlier. and as the lock disengaged, the smell vanished. Not gradually, not fading into the ambient air, but gone between one breath and the next, as though someone had thrown a switch. The temperature in the corridor dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog in the beam of my flashlight. I stood there, key still in the lock, and felt the full weight of what I'd just done settle over me like a burial shroud. I had locked the door, turning the key clockwise, the normal direction, the way locks have worked since their invention, but the door had only opened when I turned it the other way, as though I'd sealed it backward, as though the act of locking had somehow... I forced the thought down, crushed it before it could fully form. There were rational explanations. The lock mechanism had been installed incorrectly. Some quirk of the building's renovation had reversed the hardware. The smell had dissipated naturally, coincidentally timing itself with my opening the door. I radioed dispatch. The system was back online with power restored, and reported a possible gas leak, now resolved. The on-call facilities manager arrived 40 minutes later, bleary and irritated. We inspected the thermal chamber together. Its control panel showed no record of recent operation. The interior was cool to the touch. No equipment malfunction, no sign of unauthorized access, no trace of the smell that had saturated the air. The facilities manager gave me the look I'd been dreading, the one that suggested I was either incompetent or crazy, possibly both. He made a note in his log about reported odor, unable to verify source, and left, muttering about false alarms and wasted call-outs. I completed the rest of my shift in a fog of doubt and exhaustion. Dawn arrived with its usual indifference, sunlight streaming through the building's narrow windows and making everything seem mundane again. Students began arriving for early lab sessions, chattering about exams and weekend plans, completely unaware that they were walking through space that had felt fundamentally wrong just hours before. I should have let it go, filed it under unexplained but ultimately harmless, and moved on. But that afternoon, before my shift began, I went to the college archives. The Naval Arsenal records were incomplete. Most had been transferred to federal repositories when the facility closed, but the archive held building schematics and some operational logs. I found references to the Ordnance Testing Office, to experiments involving thermal stress analysis of explosive materials. The logs ended abruptly in March 1963, with a terse notation about discontinued operations pending facility transfer. No mention of accidents, no incident reports, just a clean bureaucratic ending to 40 years of weapons testing. I found extension 4731 in the old phone directory, listed under the name of someone whose position was identified only as testing supervisor. The entry had been crossed out in blue ink, a single line through the number, as though someone wanted to ensure it could never be dialed again. That night, I walked my rounds with heightened awareness, noting every sound, every shadow, every fluctuation in the building's ambient noise. The forensics building stood quiet and ordinary. The thermal analysis lab remained properly locked, the door sitting flush in its frame, no unusual smells, no signs of disturbance. But as I passed the lab at 2:47 a.m., I heard something that stopped me mid-stride. A phone ringing inside the locked room. Not a modern digital tone, but the mechanical bell ring of an old rotary phone, insistent and anachronistic. I stood frozen in the corridor, listening to it ring. 4 times. 5. Then silence, followed by the softest sound, like someone on the other end had picked up and was listening, waiting for me to speak first. I didn't open the door. I didn't use my key, clockwise or counterclockwise. I walked away, finished my rounds on the other side of campus, and wrote nothing in my shift report. Because I had understood something in that moment, something that I could never prove and never fully articulate. The building wasn't haunted in any traditional sense. There was no ghost, no residual energy, no tragic past demanding recognition. It was simpler and stranger than that. Some doors, once opened a certain way, create a path that persists. Some locks, when turned against their nature, don't seal things out. They seal things in, or worse, they seal them halfway, existing in a state between secured and accessible, present and absent, then and now. I had locked that door by turning the key backward, and in doing so, I had undone something. or done something that didn't align with the linear progression of cause and effect that I'd always taken for granted. The worst part wasn't the smell or the sounds or the impossible phone call. The worst part was knowing that I could go back right now, turn that key counterclockwise again, and the door would open onto something that had been waiting there since 1963, or perhaps even longer, waiting in the space created by reversed locks and backwards causality, in the gap between securing and unsealing. I still work the night shift at Harrington College. I still make my rounds through the forensics building, and I carry my full key ring, each key tagged and organized. But there's one key I never use anymore, the yellow tagged one, marked for the thermal analysis lab. It stays on the ring, the metal slowly tarnishing with age and neglect, because removing it would be an acknowledgement that I'm avoiding something. Some nights, when I pass that door at 2:47 a.m., I think I hear breathing from inside. Steady, rhythmic, patient, and I remember the smell, burnt meat and something sweeter underneath, something that might have been human once but had been changed by intense heat and pressure into something else entirely. I remember the resistance of the lock as I turned it the wrong way, and the smooth click of tumblers falling into place in a direction they were never designed to move. And I keep walking, because the alternative, stopping, using that key again, turning it counterclockwise and finding out what's been waiting behind that backward locked door, is something I'm not ready to face. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the key remains on my ring, and the door remains locked. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, something continues to exist, neither fully sealed away nor completely accessible, waiting in a state that defies the simple binary of open and closed. And late at night, when the building settles into its deepest silence, I wonder, did I lock something in, or did I lock myself out? Did I seal away a danger, or did I create a barrier between myself and an answer I desperately need? The uncertainty gnaws at me more than any definitive horror could, because knowing that monsters exist is terrifying, but knowable. Suspecting that you might have created a door to somewhere impossible, and that you're the only one who can open it again, that's a different kind of terror entirely. One that follows you home. One that turns every locked door into a question mark. One that makes you pause before turning any key, wondering, am I sealing this properly, or am I doing it backward, creating another impossible threshold? The building keeps its secrets. I keep mine. And the key, that yellow-tagged key that fits a lock that only opens in reverse, stays on my ring, growing heavier with each passing night. Story 5. The controller sat on the third shelf, right between a framed photo from graduation and a ceramic mug from that road trip to Sedona. Dust had gathered on its edges, fine and gray like the desert sand that settled on everything in Tempe during monsoon season. I'd wiped the shelf clean 4 days ago, 5 days before that. Every Saturday morning for the past 8 months, I'd run a cloth along that wood, and every time by Tuesday the dust had returned to claim its territory around the black plastic. I could have moved it, should have moved it, donated it to Goodwill or tossed it in the closet with the other things I couldn't quite process yet. But there was something about seeing it there, its shape so familiar it had become part of the apartment's architecture, that felt necessary, like keeping vigil, like maintaining a promise I'd never actually made. The Arizona sun hammered against the blinds, striping my living room with bars of gold and shadow. Outside, someone's car alarm bleated 3 times before cutting off. A motorcycle growled down University Drive. Normal, Saturday morning sounds in a college town where half the population had already fled for summer break. The kind of ordinary noise that should have been comforting, but instead felt like static, white noise papering over something I didn't want to acknowledge. I'd been standing in front of the shelf for 10 minutes, maybe longer. Time had developed this elastic quality lately, stretching and compressing in ways my therapist said were normal for grief. Except I'd stopped correcting her 3 sessions ago when she used that word. Grief implied an ending. This felt more like suspension, like standing in an airport terminal waiting for a flight that would never board. The night before, I dreamed about Thorne again. Same dream as always. We were back in our dorm room junior year, controllers in hand, the old CRT television casting everything in blue-white light. He was laughing at something. His laugh, that barking sound that started in his chest and exploded outward. But when I tried to turn my head to see what was so funny, I couldn't move. I could only watch his reflection in the dark window, his face pixelated and strange, mouth moving but the sound coming from somewhere else, somewhere far away. I'd woken up at 4:17 a.m. with my heart beating against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The apartment had been silent except for the refrigerator's hum and something else, something underneath that I'd convinced myself was just the building settling. Old construction, the landlord had said when I signed the lease. You get used to the noises, but I hadn't gotten used to them. If anything, I'd become more attuned to every creak and groan, every whisper of sound that suggested the space around me wasn't as empty as it should be. I checked my phone. 9:30 a.m. The weekend stretched ahead like a wasteland. My boss had suggested I take more time, use my vacation days, but staying home felt worse than the distraction of work. At home, there were too many reminders, too many objects that served as anchors to a version of reality that no longer quite fit. The controller stared at me from the shelf. Not at me. It was an inanimate object, plastic and circuitry and nothing more. But that's what it felt like. A watching, a waiting. I remembered the bet. God, it was stupid. The kind of thing you commit to when you're 20 and beer tastes like possibility, and losing means buying pizza, not carrying around a knot of unfinished business for the rest of your life. We'd been playing the same game since sophomore year, a sports title that had been outdated even then, but it was our game, our ritual. Every Thursday night, same teams, same trash talk, same moment at the 3-minute mark in the third quarter when we'd pause to order food and argue about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Thorne always picked the underdog team, always made the same substitutions, bench the star player, bring in the rookie, swap the defensive formation to something unconventional that somehow worked 30% of the time. When it did work, he'd grin that lopsided grin and say the same thing. Chaos theory, man. Chaos theory. The bet was simple. First one to win 50 games bought the other a case of their favorite beer. We'd been tied at 49 for 3 months when it happened. When it happened. Even in my own head, I couldn't name it clearly. The accident? The incident? The event? The police report had used clinical language. Single vehicle collision, driver unresponsive at the scene, status undetermined pending investigation. Undetermined. As if Thorne had simply paused mid-game and walked away from the controller. I'd gone to the hospital twice. They'd let me in once. He'd looked wrong under the fluorescent lights, connected to machines that breathed for him, beeped his existence into the sterile air. The doctors used words like minimal activity and waiting to see, and these situations are unpredictable. His parents had flown in from Chicago. His mom had held my hand in the waiting room and thanked me for being such a good friend, as if friendship was past tense, as if we'd already buried something. The third time I'd tried to visit, they'd told me he'd been transferred. Where? Another facility. Which one? They couldn't say. When I'd pushed, the nurse had given me a look that suggested I was asking the wrong questions, that there were protocols and privacies I didn't understand. I'd called his parents. His mom had said they were handling it, that she'd let me know when there was news, and I'd heard in her voice the weight of something she wasn't saying. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of Saturday mornings cleaning around his controller. 8 months of checking my phone for messages that never came. 8 months of that dream, his pixelated face in the window, laughing at something I couldn't see. The console was still set up under the TV. I hadn't touched it since that last Thursday night, the one before everything fragmented. The game disc was probably still inside, waiting at whatever screen we'd left it on. Player 1 and Player 2, frozen mid-action. A thought had been circling my mind for weeks now, landing and taking off and landing again like a crow that couldn't decide whether to stay. It was a stupid thought, childish, the kind of thing you'd see in a movie and roll your eyes at because grief doesn't work like that, reality doesn't work like that, and even if it did, What would be the point? But it kept circling anyway. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee I didn't want, just to have something to do with my hands. The machine gurgled and hissed, and through the window above the sink, I could see Mrs. Yamamoto watering her plants on the balcony next door. She waved. I waved back. Normal. Everything was normal. Except the apartment felt different this morning. Thicker somehow, the air heavier, like the pressure change before a storm. My skin prickled with that sensation of being watched, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Just my furniture, my belongings, my life arranged in a space that was supposed to feel like mine, but increasingly felt like I was borrowing it from someone else. I dumped the coffee down the sink. My hands were shaking slightly. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed all the blinds. The apartment sank into a gray dimness, shapes losing their definition, edges softening. I found a candle in the bathroom cabinet, some cedar-scented thing my ex had left behind, and lit it on the coffee table. The flame guttered, then steadied, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The console's power button glowed red in standby mode. I knelt in front of the TV and pressed it. The system hummed to life with a sound I'd forgotten, a mechanical purr that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. The screen flickered through its startup sequence. A logo, loading. The menu appeared, and there it was. Our saved game, paused at 3 minutes and 17 seconds in the third quarter. Player 1 leading by 4 points. The last moment before everything stopped. I picked up my controller from the floor where I'd left it months ago. The plastic felt strange in my hands, heavier than I remembered. Or maybe my hands had gotten weaker. I looked at the shelf, at his controller. This is insane, I thought. You're having some kind of episode. Call your therapist. Call someone. Don't do this. But I was already standing, already reaching for the second controller, already feeling the weight of it in my left hand while mine sat in my right. I placed both controllers on the coffee table side by side like I was setting up for game night. Like Thorne was about to walk through the door with pizza and that stupid grin. The candle flame bent sideways, though there was no breeze. I sat on the couch, my controller in my hands, his on the table untouched. "Okay," I said to the empty room. "Your move." Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. What had I expected? The screen showed our paused game, players frozen mid-action. The clock stopped at 3:17. The apartment was silent except for the console's fan and my own breathing, which sounded ragged and too fast. I was about to stand up, to turn everything off and maybe finally call that therapist back, when his controller's LED flickered. Just once. A brief pulse of blue light. I stopped breathing. The light flickered again, stronger this time. Then steady. On. On the screen, player 2's cursor moved. It drifted across the menu with deliberate purpose, selecting the team roster. I watched, my own controller forgotten in my lap, as the cursor highlighted a name. The bench player, the rookie. The same substitution Thorne always made at this exact moment in the game. The cursor confirmed the selection, moved to the next player, made another swap, then another. Each change identical to the pattern I'd seen hundreds of times. The exact sequence Thorne always used. The unconventional strategy that somehow worked 30% of the time. My mouth had gone dry. The room felt cold despite the Arizona heat pressing against the windows. The cursor moved to unpause the game. Hesitated. The blue light on the controller pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Or maybe my heartbeat was matching its rhythm. I couldn't tell anymore. Then the cursor moved one more time, highlighting the pause function. Not to unpause, to adjust the pause time. It moved the clock forward, minute by minute, until it stopped at exactly 3:17. The moment we always stopped to order food. The moment we always argued about pineapple on pizza. Our ritual. The controller vibrated once on the coffee table, a sharp buzz that made me jump. The screen showed the scoreboard resetting, both teams returning to 0. Game over. Match complete. The tie broken after 8 months of suspension. The blue light on his controller flickered 3 times, then died. I lunged forward, grabbing the controller, pressing buttons, shaking it. Nothing. Dead plastic in my hands, as cold and inert as it had been sitting on that shelf. "Thorn?" My voice cracked. "Thorn? What the hell?" The candle flame bent again, nearly horizontal, though the air in the apartment remained perfectly still. I could see my reflection in the dark TV screen now, hunched over the coffee table, clutching a dead controller, alone in a dim room on a Saturday morning. Or was I alone? The sensation of being watched had intensified, a pressure against my back like someone standing just behind the couch. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed not to turn around. I turned around. Nothing. Empty apartment, closed blinds, shadows pooling in corners. But something was different. On the shelf, in the space where his controller had sat for 8 months, there was a perfect rectangle of clean wood. No dust. As if the controller had only just been removed moments ago. As if those 8 months of Saturday cleaning, of dust returning every week, had never happened at all. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, loud in the silence. I grabbed it with shaking hands. A text from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. A hospital room, sterile and white. Medical equipment. A bed. Empty. The sheets were pulled back, rumpled, as if someone had just gotten up and walked away. The machines were off, their screens dark. A water cup sat on the bedside table, still half full. The timestamp on the photo, 9:47 a.m., 15 minutes ago. I stared at the image until my eyes burned. There was no message explaining it, no follow-up text. Nothing to tell me if this was Thorne's room, if he'd woken up, if he'd been moved again, if this was some kind of sick joke or a miracle or something I couldn't begin to categorize. The apartment felt different now, not emptier, but differently occupied, as if the 8 months of suspension had finally snapped, reality rearranging itself around an absence I'd been refusing to name. I looked at the controller in my hands, still dead, still cold. I set it back on the coffee table next to mine. On the TV screen, the game menu had returned to its title screen. Press start, blinked in the corner. Player 1. Waiting. The candle had burned down to a stub, wax pooling on the coffee table. How long had I been sitting here? The light coming through the edges of the blinds had shifted, afternoon sun replacing morning gold. Hours had passed, or minutes stretched to feel like hours. Time doing that elastic thing again. I should call someone. His parents, the hospital, the police. Someone who could tell me what that photo meant, where Thorne was, whether any of what just happened was real, or if I'd finally slipped into the kind of episode my therapist had been carefully not mentioning might happen. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. Because there was a sound now, so faint I might have been imagining it. A sound like breathing that wasn't mine. A presence in the room that felt familiar and foreign all at once. The blue LED on his controller pulsed once more, then went dark. And in that moment of darkness, I understood something I wished I didn't. The bet was settled. The game was over. But the score, the real score, wasn't about wins or losses or who bought the beer. It was about which one of us was still playing, and which one had finally learned to let go. I stood up on legs that felt uncertain, walked to the window and opened the blinds. Sunlight flooded the apartment, harsh and real, banishing shadows to the corners where they belonged. Outside, life continued. Cars passed, people walked. The world turned indifferent to the small mysteries of one man's grief. When I turned back to the shelf, the clean rectangle of wood had a thin layer of dust on it already, as if 8 months had never been interrupted at all, as if I'd been the one suspended this whole time, and only just now returned to a world that had kept moving without me. I picked up my phone and looked at the photo again, but when I opened my messages, the unknown number was gone. The conversation thread had disappeared. Just my normal texts remained, mundane and ordinary and offering no evidence of anything unusual. I checked my call log, my photos, my deleted folder. Nothing. The controller sat on the coffee table, its LED dark, its plastic shell holding no secrets. Just a dead controller in an apartment in Tempe, Arizona. owned by a man who couldn't quite remember if he'd played a game this morning or simply sat in the dark for hours, watching shadows and manufacturing meaning from grief. But on my hand, where I'd gripped his controller, my fingers tingled with the phantom memory of vibration. And in the air, just barely detectable, I could smell it. Pepperoni and pineapple. The apartment settled around me, floorboards creaking in that way the landlord said was normal. Outside, someone laughed. A door slammed. Life, continuing. I looked at the two controllers on the coffee table, mine and his, Player 1 and Player 2, and I wondered, as the Arizona sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter, which one of us had finally won, which one of us was still here, and whether the bet had ever really been about the game at all. Story 6. The loft had always felt too large at night, its industrial bones exposed like the ribcage of something long dead. I'd grown accustomed to the ambient hum of Chicago bleeding through the brick walls. Distant sirens, the L train's metallic shriek, the bass-heavy throb from the club 3 blocks over. But that particular November, the sounds began to feel like they were coming from inside the walls themselves, a frequency just below hearing that made my teeth ache. Ezra and I had been working on the album for 6 weeks straight, our sleep schedules inverted and fractured. The mixing board sat between our mattresses like a glowing altar, cables snaking across the concrete floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sometimes I'd wake to find him hunched over it at 4 a.m, headphones on, his fingers moving across the faders with the precision of someone performing surgery. He never remembered these sessions when I asked about them. The night it started, we'd been layering tracks until the individual sounds lost meaning, just textures of noise that occasionally cohered into something resembling music. My eyes burned from staring at the monitor, and when I finally collapsed onto my mattress, I kept them open out of habit rather than intention. Sleep had become a negotiation my body frequently lost. The ceiling was 15 feet above me, a patchwork of original tin tiles and newer drywall repairs. I knew every water stain, every seam. So when the air began to shimmer directly above the mixing board, I noticed immediately. It started as a visual static, like heat distortion, then slowly coalesced into something structured. Geometric. The dodecahedron formed gradually, its edges appearing first as faint phosphorescent lines, then solidifying into translucent bars that pulsed with their own interior light. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange calm, as if some part of my brain had simply accepted this impossibility as the natural conclusion of too many sleepless nights. The shape was hollow, each edge a tube of pale green luminescence that reminded me of old emergency exit signs. The bars connected and disconnected in silence, joints sliding apart and reforming with mechanical precision. It rotated slowly, and I became aware that I was holding my breath, counting the faces. 12 pentagons, exactly as there should be. That's when Ezra spoke from across the studio, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with something between awe and dread. "You seeing this?" The relief that flooded through me was profound and immediately troubling. If we were both hallucinating, what did that mean? Shared psychosis? Carbon monoxide? Some frequency in our recordings that had damaged our visual cortex? But the thing above us continued its silent rotation, indifferent to our attempts at rational explanation. Then it changed. The transition happened in an instant. The bars dissolved and reformed as flat triangular panels, like a software update rendering in real time. The new configuration was sharper, more aggressive. The triangles overlapped in impossible angles, their surfaces reflecting nothing despite the glow emanating from within. I watched as Ezra sat up on his mattress, his silhouette backlit by the shape's cold radiance. My arm extended upward before I'd consciously decided to reach for it. The moment my fingers entered the space beneath the dodecahedron, pressure clamped around my forearm. Not painful, but intensely cold, like plunging into ice water. The sensation traveled up through my shoulder and into my chest, and I jerked back. The shape blinked out of existence as if it had never been there. The darkness that followed felt absolute, charged with absence. I could hear Ezra breathing rapidly across the studio, then the sound of him fumbling for his phone. The screen's glow illuminated his face, and I saw that his eyes were wide, unblinking. What the fuck was that? His voice cracked on the last word. I sat up, my arm still tingling with residual cold. We stumbled through theories: gas leak, electromagnetic interference from the equipment, some kind of projection. But none of it explained the pressure on my arm, the weight of something that shouldn't exist. Eventually, exhaustion pulled us both under, though I don't remember falling asleep. I remember only Ezra's suggestion that we check the ventilation in the morning, and then nothing. When sunlight finally filtered through the industrial windows, I woke to Ezra standing beside my mattress, his phone extended. The photo on the screen showed a perfect circle of dust around my bed, as if someone had walked in a precise geometric loop. But there were no footprints leading to or from the circle. No disturbance in the dust anywhere else. Just that unbroken ring, like a boundary marker drawn by something meticulous and inhuman. "I didn't hear you get up," he said, his voice carefully neutral. I didn't get up. We stood there for a long moment, looking at the evidence of something neither of us could explain. Then Ezra deleted the photo, and we didn't speak about it for 3 days. But the loft had changed. Or we had changed. Or both. Small things at first. Angles that seemed subtly wrong when I looked at them peripherally, then snapped back to normal when I focused. The mixing board's faders would be in different positions than I remembered setting them, the levels creating patterns that my mind tried to resolve into meaning. Ezra started wearing headphones even when he wasn't listening to anything, and I caught him muttering calculations under his breath, his fingers tracing invisible equations in the air. The dodecahedron returned 9 days later. This time it appeared in the late afternoon, materializing above the kitchenette while I was making coffee. The afternoon light coming through the windows should have washed it out, but instead it cast geometric shadows that moved against the direction of the sun. I watched those shadows crawl across the brick wall, forming and reforming into patterns that almost resembled language, almost conveyed meaning. Ezra emerged from the bathroom and stopped mid-step. We didn't speak. What was there to say? The shape hung there for 7 minutes. I counted, then dissolved like frost under heat. When it vanished, we found another circle of dust, this one around the dining table we never used. After that, the appearances became more frequent, once or twice a day, sometimes more. The dodecahedron would manifest in different areas of the loft, its material shifting between the bar configuration and the triangular panels, occasionally introducing new geometries, hexagonal faces, spiral edges that hurt to look at directly. Each time we'd find a new circle of dust afterward, always perfect, always unexplained. We stopped inviting people over. How could we explain the circles that now marked the floor like a strange cartography? How could we articulate the feeling that something was measuring the space, cataloging it, preparing for something we couldn't name? The paranoia crept in gradually, disguised as reasonable concern. I started checking the windows obsessively, making sure they were locked, though I couldn't articulate what I thought might enter through them. Ezra installed new deadbolts on the door, 3 of them, and began sleeping with a baseball bat beside his mattress. Against what? Neither of us could say. Our music suffered. The recording's playback revealed sounds we hadn't recorded, faint geometric clicking, frequencies that made my inner ear ache. We'd spend hours trying to isolate these phantom noises, only to lose track of time and find ourselves staring at the same waveform for what felt like minutes, but turned out to be hours. The mixing board seemed to operate by its own logic now. Channels would activate themselves. Effects would engage without input. 3 weeks after the first sighting, I woke to find Ezra standing at the window, his forehead pressed against the glass. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the city glow illuminated his face enough for me to see that his eyes were moving rapidly beneath closed lids. He was sleepwalking, or something like it. When I touched his shoulder, he jerked awake with a gasp. "I was counting them," he said, his voice hollow. "Counting what?" "The edges, the vertices, the angles. It's all wrong. The math doesn't work." A dodecahedron can't exist the way it exists. He turned to look at me, and his pupils were dilated despite the ambient light. Unless it's not actually three-dimensional, unless what we're seeing is just the shadow of something in higher dimensions, and the circles are where it touches down, and we're... Stop. I said it more sharply than I intended, because I'd been having similar thoughts, had spent hours researching geometric impossibilities and hyperdimensional theory, but giving voice to it felt dangerous, like naming something would give it more power. Ezra laughed, a brittle sound. You're right. We're just tired, sleep-deprived. Maybe there's mold in the walls. Maybe we should get tested for... The dodecahedron appeared between us, close enough that I could have touched it without extending my arm. This time it didn't pulse with light but seemed to absorb it. A geometric hole in reality, and for the first time, it made a sound. A low resonance that I felt in my chest cavity more than heard. The sound grew, and I realized it was voices, dozens of them, speaking in perfect synchronization, saying words in a language that my brain insisted it should understand but couldn't quite parse. Ezra reached out before I could stop him. His hand entered the space where the dodecahedron hovered, and his entire body went rigid. For 3 seconds, I counted. He stood frozen, his arm disappearing into impossible geometry. Then he stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest. When he opened his palm, I saw a perfect geometric pattern burned into his skin, like a brand, too precise to be accidental. It showed me, he whispered, his voice shaking. It showed me what it's building. We're part of the blueprint. The circles are markers. The appearances are measurements. It's constructing something, and the loft is just the foundation. And he looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge. We're the anchors. It needs consciousness to bridge the dimensions. It needs us to witness it, to make it real by observing it. We're collapsing the wave function over and over, and each time we do, it gets more solid, more present, more... Stop talking. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, but he couldn't stop. Or wouldn't. The words poured out of him in a torrent. Quantum mechanics and sacred geometry, observer effects and consciousness as a fundamental property of space-time. And the terrible thing was, it made sense. All of it made a horrible, crystalline sense. The appearances increased. Multiple times per day now, sometimes several in an hour. The dodecahedron would materialize, shift through its configurations, then vanish. Each time, new circles of dust. The loft began to look like a geometric ritual site, concentric patterns spreading outward from some invisible center. We couldn't clean them away. When we tried, the dust would reorganize itself within hours, recreating the circles with stubborn precision. Sleep became impossible. When I closed my eyes, I saw geometric patterns, endless tessellations of polygons that folded into higher dimensions. I'd wake gasping, convinced I could feel something touching me with pressure that had no source, mapping my body with invisible instruments. Ezra started talking to himself constantly, muttering equations and theorems, occasionally laughing at private jokes about the nature of reality. Last Tuesday, or was it Thursday? The temporal markers have become unreliable. I found him standing in the center of the largest circle, arms outstretched, head tilted back. The dodecahedron hovered above him, but it had changed again. Now it was rotating along multiple axes simultaneously, impossible movement that my eyes couldn't track. And Ezra was rotating too, slowly, his feet apparently rooted to the spot but his body turning through space as if he were on an invisible turntable. When the shape vanished and he collapsed, I ran to him. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when he finally looked at me, I wasn't sure if he recognized me. "It's almost complete," he said, his voice dreamy. "Just a few more observations, a few more witnesses. Then it'll have enough dimensional stability to fully manifest." Manifest as what? His smile was beatific and terrible. A doorway, an anchor point, the place where two realities intersect. We're going to see something that no human consciousness has ever... He stopped, his expression shifting to confusion. Or maybe we're going insane. Maybe there is no dodecahedron. Maybe we've been poisoning ourselves with something in the loft. And this is just our neurons misfiring in synchronized patterns because we've spent too much time together in this space and... The burn on your hand is real, I interrupted. He looked down at his palm, where the geometric pattern was still clearly visible. Is it? Or did I do that to myself and create a false memory of how it happened? How do we know what's real anymore? I couldn't answer. Still can't. Because every explanation feels both completely true and utterly false. Either we're experiencing something genuinely impossible, something that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space but does, or we've both succumbed to the same delusion, our minds deteriorating in perfect parallel, creating shared hallucinations to explain whatever mundane truth we can't face. The dodecahedron appeared above us as we spoke, and this time, neither of us reacted. It's become background radiation now, a constant presence whether visible or not. I can feel it in the spaces between moments, in the angles where walls meet, in the geometric precision of shadows falling across the floor. Last night, this morning, time has lost coherence. I lay on my mattress with eyes open, watching the shape rotate through configurations that my mind can no longer fully process. Ezra was across the studio, either asleep or unconscious or somewhere else entirely, and I became aware that I was counting under my breath, counting edges, faces, vertices. The numbers were wrong, always wrong. The geometry doesn't resolve. Unless we're wrong about geometry, unless the rules we think govern reality are just local approximations, and something else operates by different mathematics entirely. I reached up again, unable to resist. The cold pressure wrapped around my arm, and this time I didn't pull away. I let it travel up through my shoulder, into my chest, spreading through my neural pathways like ice water through veins. And in that moment of connection, I understood something fundamental that I can't articulate because language isn't designed for concepts that exist in more than 3 spatial dimensions. When I opened my eyes, Ezra was standing over me, his face illuminated by the dodecahedron's sick light. "Did you see it too?" he asked. "Did you see what we're becoming?" I couldn't answer, because I had seen something, and it was either the most profound revelation or the most complete psychotic break, and I genuinely don't know which terrifies me more. The circles of dust now cover the entire floor. We walk through them like a labyrinth, following paths that seem to lead somewhere specific, though we don't know the destination. The dodecahedron appears constantly now, sometimes multiple instances simultaneously, surrounding us with impossible geometry. And the terrible thing, the truly, utterly terrible thing, is that I'm starting to see the beauty in it. The perfection, the mathematical inevitability. Ezra says we should leave. I agree. We should absolutely leave. But we haven't left. Won't leave. Because some part of us needs to see what happens when the construction is complete. What emerges when enough consciousness has witnessed it into stability. What comes through when the doorway fully opens. Or maybe there is no doorway. Maybe there are just 2 men in a loft in Chicago, sleep-deprived and sick, their minds creating elaborate shared delusions to avoid confronting something simpler and more terrible about their deteriorating mental states. The dodecahedron hovers above me now as I write this. It's changed again. The geometry has become so complex that I can no longer track all the faces and edges. It's beautiful. It's horrifying. It's absolutely impossible. It's absolutely real. Ezra is standing in a circle of dust, arms outstretched, head tilted back. He's smiling, or grimacing. The distinction has lost meaning. I should stop writing. I should call someone. I should leave this place and never come back. But I won't. Because I need to know. We both need to know. And besides, the circles are still being drawn. The measurements are still being taken. The construction is still incomplete. Whatever's coming, we're almost ready for it. Or it's almost ready for us. I can no longer tell the difference. Story 7. The smell hit me first. Mildew and old paper. mixed with something else I couldn't place. Something stale, like breath held too long. The Henderson Elementary Library had been sealed for 8 months, waiting for the town to decide its fate. Now it was going to be a community center, and I was the one who had to make sure the building wouldn't collapse on someone's book club meeting. My supervisor had given me the keys that morning with barely a glance. Check the windows, test the electrical, make sure nothing had nested in the walls. Standard stuff for a maintenance contractor. The building was mine for the afternoon. Just me and 20 years of accumulated silence. The main reading room stretched out before me, dominated by those tall windows that architects in the 70s thought made everything look modern. Dust hung in the air, visible in the weak October light filtering through the glass. Someone had stacked all the chairs on the tables before they locked up, probably in a hurry. They sat there in crooked towers, 3 or 4 chairs high, like miniature monuments to abandonment. I started with the windows along the east wall, checking each frame for warping. The latches were stiff, unused for months. The third window fought me, and I had to lean my weight into it to get it to close properly. That's when I heard the first sound, a soft scraping, like wood on wood. I turned, expecting to see a squirrel or maybe a bird that had gotten in through a broken pane somewhere. Nothing. Just the chairs on their tables, casting long shadows across the floor. I went back to the windows, but the sound came again. Scraping. Deliberate. I stopped, listening. The building settled around me with the kind of creaks old structures make, but this was different. This was movement with intention behind it. The chair on the nearest table, a blue plastic thing with metal legs, shifted. Just an inch, maybe less. I watched it, my hand still on the window latch. It didn't move again. My rational mind supplied explanations. Uneven floor, vibrations from my footsteps, the building settling. But I'd been doing this work for 6 years, and I knew what settling looked like. This wasn't that. I moved to the next window, keeping one eye on the chairs. The room felt different now, the silence less empty than before, more like something was holding its breath, waiting. I tested the window latch. It clicked into place with a sound that seemed too loud. The lights flickered, not the kind of flicker that comes from old wiring or a loose connection. This was rhythmic. 3 short pulses, too long. 3 short, too long. Like a pattern, like a code. I stood there in the stuttering light, counting the intervals. 3 short, too long. 3 short, too long. Then darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in that sickly yellow-green glow that makes shadows look wrong. I pulled out my phone, checked the time. 3:14 p.m. I made a mental note to check the electrical panel, though something in my gut told me I wouldn't find anything wrong with the wiring. When I looked up, the blue chair had moved again. This time there was no mistaking it. It sat at the very edge of the table now, teetering. I stared at it, waiting. The emergency lights hummed, a sound that seemed to dig into my skull. The chair didn't fall. It just waited there, hanging over the edge like a held breath. I forced myself to move, to keep checking windows. Work was real. Work was normal. Work was something I could control. But my hands were shaking now, and I hated myself for it. I'd worked in empty buildings before, schools, offices, a hospital once. They were just places, just walls and floors and the accumulated weight of human presence, now absent. But this felt different. This felt inhabited. The next window stuck worse than the others. I had to set my toolbox down and use both hands, bracing my foot against the wall for leverage. The frame groaned in protest, the old wood protesting against my efforts. Behind me, I heard it. The scrape of chair legs on wood, a slow, deliberate slide, and then the crash. The blue chair had fallen. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The chair lay on its side on the floor about 6 feet from the table, not beneath it where it should have landed, 6 feet away, as if it had been thrown or carried. The lights came back on, full brightness, no flicker. The sudden illumination made me squint, made the fallen chair look absurdly mundane in the harsh fluorescent glare. I walked over to it, picked it up. Solid, normal, just a chair. I set it upright and left it there on the floor. I wasn't going to put it back on the table. That's when the rest of them started. The sound began at the far end of the room. That same wooden scraping, but multiplied. I watched, rooted to the spot, as chair after chair began to shift on their tables. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, then faster. They moved toward the edges in a wave, a cascade of motion that rippled through the room from back to front. Not random, sequential, deliberate. One by one, they fell. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. Crash after crash, a percussion of impacts that seemed to roll toward me like thunder. I backed up against the windows, my hands pressed flat against the cold glass, as the chairs tumbled to the floor in a perfect domino effect. Each one falling exactly as the one before it reached the ground, like a choreographed performance. Like something was pushing them. Like something was making its way through the room, making its way toward me. The last stack sat on the table nearest the door. 4 chairs, red plastic ones with scratched legs. They hadn't moved yet. Everything else had fallen. 30, maybe 40 chairs scattered across the floor in an almost perfect line leading from the back of the room to where I stood. But these 4 remained, waiting. The lights flickered again. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, 2 long. The rhythm was burned into my brain now, an insistent pulse that matched my heartbeat. I realized with a cold certainty what it reminded me of. Keys on a belt loop. The kind janitors wore, the kind that rattled with each step. The kind that would have walked these halls years ago, checking doors, turning off lights, making sure everything was secure for the night. The kind that would know every inch of this building, every window, every exit. I needed to leave. The realization came sudden and sharp, cutting through my paralysis. I pushed off from the window and started toward the door, stepping over and around the fallen chairs. My boots crunched on something, broken plastic from one of the chair seats that had cracked when it hit the floor. The sound was too loud, too sharp. It made me move faster. The remaining chairs on the table by the door began to shift. I was 15 feet away. 10. The chairs scraped across the table surface, moving toward the edge with that same terrible deliberateness. I could see the door beyond them, the push bar gleaming dull silver in the fluorescent light. 5 feet away. The first chair fell as I reached for the door handle. The second followed before my fingers touched the metal. The third hit the ground as my palm made contact with the push bar, the impact sending vibrations through my hand, up my arm. I could feel the cold of the metal, could feel my own pulse hammering in my fingertips. The fourth chair stayed where it was. I pushed. The door didn't budge. I pushed harder, throwing my weight against it, but it held firm, locked. Impossible. These doors opened from the inside, fire code required it. I could see the mechanism, could see that nothing was blocking it, but it wouldn't move. Behind me, in the perfect silence that followed the crashes, I heard breathing. Not my own. Something else. Close. Right behind me. I spun around. The room was empty. Chairs scattered across the floor. Tables standing like islands in a sea of debris. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But the air felt wrong, displaced, as if something had just moved past me. Through me. The last chair fell. It toppled slowly, gracefully, landing upright on its legs as if someone had carefully placed it there. As if someone was showing me something, making a point. The lights did their pattern again, 3 short, 2 long, and in the flickering darkness between pulses, I saw it. A shape. Not quite shadow, not quite substance. It stood between me and the scattered chairs, and in the strobing light it seemed to grow more solid with each pulse. Shoulders, a torso, something that might have been arms, something that might have been reaching for me. I slammed my body against the door again, rational thought abandoned. The metal bar dug into my ribs, but the door held. Locked. Sealed. The breathing sound came again, closer now, and with it that smell. Not mildew anymore, but something worse, something that reminded me of closed spaces and no air, and things left too long in the dark. My hands scrabbled at the door, searching for another way out, another mechanism. My fingers found the small maintenance panel beside the frame, the one that housed the electronic lock system. I grabbed my screwdriver from my belt with shaking hands and pried the cover off. Inside, the display glowed with soft green letters. Door in use, not locked. Not malfunction. In use. As if someone was already holding it open. As if someone was standing right there with me, their hand on the same bar, keeping it shut while I pushed from my side. The lights flickered their pattern. 3 short, 2 long. 3 short, 2. They went out completely. In the darkness, I heard the scraping sound again, but not behind me anymore. All around me, above me. The sound of something moving through the walls, through the ceiling, through the very structure of the building itself. Making its rounds, checking the windows, testing the doors, making sure everything was secure, making sure nothing got out. My phone. I still had my phone. I pulled it from my pocket with numb fingers, the screen brightness searing after the darkness. I turned, sweeping the light across the room. Empty. Just chairs and tables and dust. The air hung still, undisturbed. But something was wrong with the chairs. I moved the phone light across them slowly, counting. 37 on the floor. 4 on the last table, still stacked. 41 total. There had been 42. I swept the light back across the room, slower this time, checking every shadow. The chairs lay scattered in their strange pattern, that line leading from the back of the room to where I stood. 41 chairs, not 42. One was missing. The push bar clicked. The sound was so sudden, so mundane, that I almost didn't process it. But there it was, that distinctive mechanical click of a door latch releasing. The door swung open, just an inch, letting in a breath of cold October air. I stared at it, at the gap between the door and frame, at the gray light of the overcast afternoon beyond. I could see the parking lot, my truck, the empty road beyond the chain-link fence, the exit. My hand moved toward the door, slowly because everything in me was screaming that this was wrong, that something was being offered to me that came with a price I didn't understand. But my hand kept moving anyway because what else could I do? My fingers wrapped around the edge of the door. The metal was so cold it burned. I pulled it open wider, 6 inches, a foot, enough to slip through. Something touched my back. Not a hand, not anything physical. Just a pressure, a presence. The feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff with someone behind you, someone who could push or could pull you back, and you wouldn't know until it happened. The lights came on inside, the full overhead fluorescence, every single one, flooding the library with harsh white illumination. I turned my head, looked back into the room. The missing chair sat in the center of the floor, upright, facing the door, facing me. I left. I didn't run. Some last thread of dignity or denial kept me walking at a normal pace. But I left, and I didn't look back. I pulled the door shut behind me, heard it latch, heard the electronic lock engage with a soft beep. The display, when I glanced at it, read, "Secure." I walked to my truck, got in, started the engine. My hands had stopped shaking. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, painting everything in gold. Normal. Real. I called my supervisor on the drive back, told him the windows were checked and the electrical needed a full inspection before they could use the building. Didn't mention the chairs, didn't mention the lights or the breathing or the feeling of something making its rounds, checking, securing, making sure everything was in its proper place. He said they'd send someone else to finish the job. I didn't argue. That night I looked up the building's history. Not much to find, just a standard elementary school built in the 70s, closed due to declining enrollment. No tragedies, no deaths, no dramatic events. Just a place where learning happened, where routine was maintained, where someone once walked the halls with keys on their belt and made sure everything was secure before they locked up for the night. Someone who maybe never stopped making those rounds. Or maybe I'd been alone in that building, breathing in mold spores and old dust. my mind creating patterns and random events because that's what minds do when they're scared and isolated. Maybe the chairs fell because the floor was uneven and the building was settling. Maybe the lights flickered because the electrical system was failing. Maybe the door stuck because the mechanism was old and I panicked. Maybe, but I can't explain the pattern. Can't explain the chair in the center of the room, upright, facing the door. Can't explain the missing 40-second chair that I know I counted correctly. Can't explain why. When I drive past the Henderson Elementary now, I always see a light on in the library window. Just one. Flickering in a rhythm I recognize. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, 2 long. Someone making their rounds. Someone making sure everything is secure. Someone still checking that all the exits work properly, from the inside out. Story 8. The rest stop materialized from the desert like a mirage refusing to dissolve. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight. The landscape outside my windshield an endless scroll of rust-colored emptiness, punctuated by the skeletal arms of Joshua trees. My bladder had been screaming for the last 40 miles. Each bump in the road a small torture. When the faded blue sign appeared, rest area 2 miles, I could have wept with relief. The parking lot was nearly empty. A semi-truck idled at the far end, its driver presumably sleeping in the cab. A dusty sedan sat closer to the building, looking like it had been there for days, maybe weeks. The structure itself was low and concrete, the kind of utilitarian architecture that belongs to no particular era, designed only to fulfill a function and nothing more. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the asphalt into a shimmering lake of heat. I parked and climbed out, my legs stiff from the drive. The air hit me like opening an oven door, dry, scorching, tasting faintly of creosote and gasoline. The building's entrance gaped before me, a dark mouth that promised shade if nothing else. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropping a blessed 15 degrees in the space of a single stride. The interior was what I expected, grimy tile floors that might have once been white, vending machines humming their monotonous song, a few scattered benches occupied by no one. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that seems designed to induce headaches. A hand-painted sign pointed down a narrow corridor. Restrooms. The arrow looked old, the paint cracked and peeling. I followed the corridor, my shoes squeaking against the floor. The walls were covered in that textured paint that always looks like cottage cheese, and someone had made a half-hearted attempt at decoration with a few faded posters of Utah's national parks. Arches, Zion, Bryce Canyon. The images looked sun-bleached and sad, like postcards from a trip no one remembers taking. The restroom was at the end of the hall, marked with a small placard. Restroom, unisex. The door was heavy wood, painted an institutional green that reminded me of old hospitals. I reached for the handle just as I heard footsteps behind me, quick, purposeful strides. A man swept past me with such speed and deliberateness that I actually stepped back. He was tall, wearing a beige overcoat that seemed absurdly heavy for the Utah heat. The coat reached nearly to his ankles, and as he moved, I caught a glimpse of the fabric, not canvas or cotton, but something that looked almost like burlap, rough and textured. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. His hand shot out, gripped the handle, and he was inside before I could protest, the door closing firmly behind him with a solid click. I stood there, staring at the green paint, my needs suddenly subordinate to my irritation. The small metal lock indicator showed red. Occupied. Fine. I could wait. The hallway was silent except for that buzzing from the lights. I shifted my weight from foot to foot, counting ceiling tiles to pass the time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Somewhere deeper in the building a door opened and closed. Footsteps that weren't my own, distant and directionless. 5, 6, 7 tiles. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. I checked my watch, though I wasn't sure why, as if confirming the time would somehow make the wait more bearable. The second hand swept around once, twice, 3 times. No sound came from beyond the door. No rush of water. No flush. No rustle of movement. Just silence. Thick and complete. I knocked. 3 sharp raps against the wood. The sound seemed to die in the air, absorbed by the walls rather than echoing. No response came. I waited, counting to 30 in my head before knocking again, harder this time. Nothing. My hand moved to the knob almost without conscious thought. It turned easily in my grip. No resistance. No lock engaged, despite what the indicator showed. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, and I stepped into the restroom with an apology already forming on my lips. The room was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. I stood there, 1 foot still in the hallway, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. The restroom was small. A single toilet in a stall with a half-height door, a sink, a mirror mounted above it that stretched from counter to ceiling. There was no window, no vent large enough for a person to climb through. The exhaust fan overhead rotated slowly, its blades crusted with dust. The floor was dry, not a single wet footprint, no drips of water, no evidence that anyone had used the sink. The faint smell of industrial cleaner hung in the air, nothing more. I walked to the stall, pushed open the door. Empty. The toilet seat was up, dry. I turned back to the sink, my reflection staring at me from the mirror with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion? Fear? Both? The man in the beige overcoat had entered this room less than 5 minutes ago. I had seen him. I had heard the door close. The lock had showed red. I checked behind the door. A ridiculous gesture that made me feel foolish even as I did it. Nothing. Of course nothing. There was nowhere to hide in this space. It was perhaps 8 feet by 6 feet, every surface visible, every corner exposed. My reflection watched me from the mirror, and I found myself studying it, looking for some explanation in my own face. Had I imagined it? Was I that tired? 6 hours of driving, the monotony of the highway, the heat beating down through the windshield. Could that have produced a hallucination? But I had felt the air move as he passed me. I had smelled something too, I realized now. A scent like old paper and something else, something organic and vaguely unpleasant. I approached the mirror, leaning close enough that my breath fogged the glass. The surface was clean, reflecting the restroom behind me with perfect clarity. The white stall door, the beige tile, the doorway leading back to the hallway, the doorway. I froze. In the mirror, the corridor beyond the restroom door was visible, a slice of that institutional green, the cracked paint of the wall. But something was wrong. The angle was wrong, or the perspective, or something. I could see farther down the hall than should have been possible from this position, as if the mirror was showing me a view from somewhere else entirely, and I wasn't in it. The reflection showed the restroom, showed the doorway, showed the corridor beyond. But I, standing here, breathing, real, cast no reflection. The mirror showed the room exactly as it was, except for the one crucial detail of my own presence. My heart began to hammer in my chest, a sick, heavy rhythm that seemed to echo in my ears. I stepped back, but the reflection didn't change. The mirror showed an empty restroom, no figure standing before it, no one at all. Then I saw it. In the reflected corridor, something moved. A fold of fabric, beige and rough-textured, sliding past the doorframe from right to left. Moving through a space where no one should be able to move, where I was standing, in fact, though the mirror insisted I wasn't there at all. The fabric disappeared, but the wrongness remained. The mirror showed the empty corridor, showed the empty restroom, showed nothing where I stood trying not to scream. I backed away from the sink, my legs hitting the toilet behind me, nearly causing me to fall. I caught myself on the stall door, the metal cold and real beneath my palm. Real. I was real. I had to be real. But the mirror disagreed. I forced myself to look again, slower this time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The reflection was perfect in every detail except for my absence. The crack in the tile behind me showed in the mirror. The dispensers for paper towels and soap reflected accurately. The graffiti someone had carved into the stall door, crude initials, and a date from 5 years ago, appeared in reversed detail on the reflected surface. Everything was there except me. I raised my hand, waved it before the mirror. Nothing. The reflection remained static, empty, indifferent to my presence. But when I moved my hand in front of the soap dispenser, the dispenser disappeared in the reflection, blocked by something invisible, by the space where I should be. The realization was worse than seeing nothing at all. The mirror wasn't lying exactly. It was showing the truth from somewhere else, some other angle, some other version of events where I had never entered this room. And in that version, something else was here instead. I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, coming closer. The soft whisper of fabric against the wall accompanied them, a sliding, brushing sound that made my skin crawl. I looked at the doorway, at the empty corridor beyond, seeing nothing. But the sounds continued, closer now, and in the mirror, I could see it. The beige coat. It was in the corridor, moving toward the restroom door, though nothing was visible when I looked directly at the hallway. Only in the reflection could I see it. Only in that impossible angle that showed a version of reality where I didn't exist. The coat moved with a strange gait, not quite walking, not quite gliding. The fabric seemed to move independently of any body beneath it, billowing and folding in ways that suggested something fundamentally wrong with the shape wearing it. As it approached the doorway, I could see that the bottom edge didn't quite touch the floor. There was a gap of perhaps an inch, and beneath it, nothing. No feet, no legs, just an absence that made my eyes hurt to look at. I wanted to run, but I was trapped. To leave the restroom, I would have to pass through the doorway, would have to move through the space where the coat was approaching in the mirror's reality. What would happen if I occupied the same space as something that existed only in reflection? What would happen if the two realities touched? The coat reached the threshold. In the mirror, it paused there, the fabric swaying slightly as if moved by a breeze that didn't exist. I could see finer details now. The weave of the material, rough and irregular, the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were stains on it, dark patches that could have been dirt, or could have been something else, something I didn't want to think about. Then it moved again, and this time I felt it. A coldness swept through the room, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with wrongness. The air pressure changed, making my ears pop. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, twice, and in that strobing instant, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. In the darkness between flickers, the coat was visible in real space. Not in the mirror, but here, in the room with me. It stood in the doorway, fuller now, more present, and I could see what passed for its face. There was no face. Where a head should have been, there was only a smooth surface, like cloth pulled taut over an egg. No features, no indication of eyes or mouth or nose. Just blank, terrible smoothness. The light came back and the coat was gone from direct sight, visible only in the mirror once more. But it was inside the room now. In the reflection, I could see it behind where I should be standing, close enough to touch. The fabric rippled, reaching forward, and I felt something brush against my shoulder. A touch like cobwebs, sticky and wrong. I bolted. Training, instinct, terror, whatever it was that moved me, I ran for the door without thinking, without planning, without any strategy beyond escape. I crashed through the doorway and into the hall, my shoulder hitting the opposite wall hard enough to send pain shooting down my arm. Behind me, I heard a sound. Not quite a whisper, not quite a sigh, but something between the two. A vocalization that came from something that shouldn't be able to vocalize at all. I ran down the corridor, not looking back, not daring to look back. The fluorescent lights flickered as I passed beneath them, each one going dark for just a moment before humming back to life. The sound followed me, that sliding, whispering sound of fabric on walls, on floor, on air itself. The main room of the rest stop was exactly as I'd left it. Empty benches, humming vending machines. The sunlight beyond the entrance looked impossibly bright, impossibly far away. I sprinted for it, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst into the parking lot and the heat hit me like a wall, but I didn't slow down. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking space with enough speed to leave rubber on the pavement. As I accelerated toward the exit, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The rest stop receded behind me, looking innocuous and ordinary in the harsh afternoon sun. The semi was still there, still idling. The dusty sedan hadn't moved. And standing in the entrance, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall figure in a beige overcoat. I focused on the road ahead, pressing the accelerator harder, putting distance between myself and that place. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. No other buildings visible, no other cars on this stretch of highway. Just heat and rock and the endless blue of the sky. I drove for an hour before I dared to slow down, before my hands stopped shaking enough to grip the wheel properly. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Exhaustion, dehydration, the mind playing tricks in isolation and heat. But I could still feel that touch on my shoulder, could still see that blank, featureless surface where a face should have been. Eventually, I pulled over at another rest stop, this one larger, newer, with multiple cars in the lot and people visible through the windows. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching people come and go, ordinary people doing ordinary things, going to the bathroom, buying snacks, stretching their legs. Normal. Everything was normal. I got out of the car slowly, walking toward the building on legs that still felt unsteady. Inside, I found the restroom without incident. Larger this time, multiple stalls, several people washing their hands at a row of sinks. I used the facilities quickly, not looking at any mirrors, not meeting anyone's eyes. As I washed my hands, I finally allowed myself to glance at my reflection. I was there, present and accounted for, exactly where I should be. The fluorescent lights overhead were steady, no flickering. The other people in the room moved normally, their reflections matching their movements with perfect accuracy. I dried my hands and walked back to my car, telling myself that I was fine, that whatever had happened back there was over now, left behind on that stretch of empty highway. But as I opened my car door, something made me turn back to look at the rest stop building. In the large window beside the entrance, I could see the interior, the tables, the vending machines, the people moving about inside, and there, standing perfectly still among the movement, was a reflection that didn't match anything in the real space. A tall figure in a beige overcoat, watching me with a face that wasn't a face. I got in my car. I started the engine. I drove. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of red and purple. Beautiful, if you could call anything beautiful after what I'd seen. I kept driving, checking my mirrors obsessively, seeing nothing but the road behind me, the sky above me, the endless landscape rolling past. But sometimes in the corner of my vision, I catch a fold of fabric, beige, rough textured, moving in a way that fabric shouldn't move. Sometimes, when I look in mirrors, in bathrooms, in stores, in the rear view as I drive, I see my reflection just a moment too late, as if it's catching up to where I actually am. And sometimes I wonder, am I in the real world, or am I in the reflection? Did I ever leave that restroom in Utah, or am I still there, standing before that mirror, watching a world I can't touch, while something else walks around in my place, wearing my face, living my life? I don't know. I can't know. But I've stopped using public restrooms, and I've covered all the mirrors in my apartment, just in case. Story 9. The knocking always came at 3:03. I know this because I started checking my phone afterward, that compulsive need to timestamp the impossible. as if the glowing numbers could somehow anchor me to something rational. 3 knocks, never 2, never 4, always spaced with that deliberate pause between them, like someone wanted me to count, like someone wanted me to know they were capable of patience. My family always talked about the jinn. Growing up, every unexplained shadow, every misplaced object, every nightmare that left you gasping, all attributed to them with the casual certainty people reserve for weather patterns. My grandmother would lower her voice when she told those stories, as if volume alone could summon them. I'd roll my eyes, exchange glances with my cousins, all of us too Americanized to believe in spirits that predated Islam, that inhabited the spaces between belief and skepticism. The basement in Dearborn was supposed to be temporary. My cousin owned the house on the corner of a street that still felt like it belonged to another country, where the call to prayer drifted from car radios and the restaurants served tea in those impossibly small glasses. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew your family back 3 generations, which meant privacy was a myth, but loneliness was supposed to be impossible. I was supposed to feel safe there. The space itself was unfinished in that particular way that basements are. Concrete floors painted gray, exposed pipes running across the ceiling like mechanical veins, that perpetual dampness that makes everything feel slightly underwater. One room partitioned off with drywall that didn't quite reach the ceiling, a bathroom with a shower stall that groaned when you turned on the water, and a narrow staircase leading up to the main house where my cousin lived with his wife. They were kind enough not to mention that I was staying longer than planned, that the few weeks had stretched into months while I figured out what came next. The first night the knocking happened, I was half asleep, that state where your mind is already dreaming, but your body hasn't quite let go. 3 deliberate raps against what I eventually determined was the exterior door, the one that led directly outside from the basement, rusted hinges and a lock that stuck. I lay there in the darkness, my heart suddenly loud enough to drown out the mechanical hum of the water heater, waiting to hear if anyone upstairs had noticed. Nothing. I counted to 30, then got up and walked through the main room to the door. The concrete was cold enough under my bare feet to make me flinch, but I barely noticed. I unlocked the door with hands that I told myself weren't shaking and pulled it open. The backyard was empty. No one on the small strip of grass. No one in the alley beyond the chain-link fence. No one anywhere. Just the smell. Damp lawn and something else. Something like ozone before a storm. That particular charge in the air that makes your skin prickle. I stood there long enough for the neighbor's motion sensor light to click off, plunging everything back into that particular urban darkness where you can still see too much. I told myself it was teenagers, kids playing a prank, someone with the wrong address. I told myself a lot of things as I locked the door and went back to bed, and I believed exactly none of them. It happened again 3 nights later. Same time. 3:03. 3 knocks with that measured pause between them. This time I got up immediately, but the routine was the same. Empty yard, that smell, that sensation of having just missed something, of being 1 second too late. I started sleeping with my phone on the nightstand, checking the time the moment I woke to those knocks. Always 3:03, never 3:02, never 3:04. My cousin asked if I was sleeping okay. He mentioned it casually over breakfast one morning, scrambled eggs and pita bread that his wife made from scratch, but there was something in his tone, something careful. I told him I was fine, and he nodded slowly, like he'd expected exactly that answer and was disappointed to receive it. I started praying again, not because I'd suddenly found religion, but because the basement felt different now, and those old habits from childhood felt like armor. You kneel, you bow, you recite words you memorized before you understood them, and maybe the structure of it, the routine, keeps something at bay. I prayed in the corner of my room where I'd hung a small prayer mat that my mother had insisted I take, one of those gestures that felt unnecessary at the time but now seemed prophetic. That's when I saw it. Him. Whatever. I was in the middle of the second cycle, forehead to the ground, eyes closed, the Arabic flowing automatically from my lips, when I opened my eyes for just a moment. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to maintain concentration, keep your mind focused on the words. But I felt something. That sensation you get when someone is standing too close, invading the space that should be yours alone. In the reflection of my window, I saw someone behind me. Not quite behind. Above somehow. Positioned exactly as I was. Bent in prostration, but hovering in the empty air where nothing should be. The figure was dark. Not shadowed, but dark. Like it absorbed light rather than blocking it. I could make out the basic shape. Head, shoulders, arms, but no details. Nothing that would let me say it was a person or something pretending to be one. I froze with my forehead still against the mat, every muscle in my body locked, my heart beating so hard I thought I might vomit. The prayer died in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't look up, couldn't do anything but stare at that reflection where something prayed in synchronization with me, mimicking the movements of submission to something neither of us could see. Then I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast at an odd angle. The product of closing my eyes too long and the blood rushing to my head from bowing. I told myself everything except what I actually felt, which was that something had been there. Something that knew exactly what I was doing and wanted me to know it was watching. I stopped praying alone after that. Sometimes I went upstairs and prayed with my cousin, making excuses about wanting company. Sometimes I didn't pray at all, which felt worse, like leaving a door unlocked deliberately, inviting something in. The knocking continued. Always 303. Always 3 times. I stopped answering. There was no point. Whatever was out there wasn't expecting me to open the door anymore. It was just checking in, maintaining contact, reminding me it was still there. My cousin's wife started looking at me strangely. She was the kind of woman who kept a spotless house and noticed when you moved something even an inch out of place. So I should have realized she'd noticed the other things. The way I'd pause mid-sentence, listening. The way I'd check behind me when I thought no one was watching. The way I started spending more time upstairs, in spaces with other people, avoiding the basement except to sleep. She mentioned very casually that the previous tenant had left suddenly, hadn't given notice, just packed up one weekend and disappeared. My cousin had laughed when she said it, mentioned something about not being able to please everyone, but she hadn't laughed. She'd just watched me with those dark, knowing eyes, and I'd felt something in my stomach drop. The night with the movie happened 2 weeks after I saw the figure in the reflection. My cousin had invited me upstairs to watch something, one of those streaming horror films that tries too hard to be clever. An exorcism story, all shaky cameras and jump scares, the kind of thing I would have laughed at a month ago. His wife was visiting family, so it was just the two of us, eating pistachios from a bowl and making the kind of sarcastic comments that distance you from what's happening on screen. We were maybe 40 minutes in when the door to the basement creaked. Not the exterior door, the interior one, the one at the top of the stairs, the one that led down to where I slept. It opened maybe an inch, perhaps less, just enough to make that perfect horror movie sound. That long, drawn-out creak that every director wishes they could capture naturally. The kind of sound that makes you think of rusted hinges and old houses and things that move when they shouldn't. Then it stopped. Not slowly. Not gradually. It just stopped, held at that precise angle, like someone had pushed it open just far enough to make the sound and then paused, waiting to see if we'd notice. Waiting to see if the timing was right. My cousin looked at the door, then at me, then back at the door. His face did something complicated, an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. Something like resignation. "Does it do that often?" he asked. His voice was carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that takes effort. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, and my hands were gripping the arms of the chair hard enough to hurt. Because I knew with absolute certainty, that there was no draft, no air current, no logical reason for that door to move at all, let alone to move like that. At that exact moment, with that exact sound. "It's an old house," my cousin said, but he didn't sound convinced. He sounded tired. "Foundation settling. Makes doors swing sometimes." Neither of us moved to close it. We finished the movie in silence, and I didn't go downstairs until he'd gone to bed. Lights off throughout the house except for the one in the kitchen that they left on all night. I stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time, looking down into the darkness below, where my phone on the nightstand cast a faint blue glow. The door had closed itself. I knew it had, even before I checked. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, it was shut completely, as if it had never moved at all. I started researching Jinn on my phone late at night, lying in bed with the brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't attract attention. Everything my grandmother had told me came flooding back, but now the words had weight. Creatures made of smokeless fire, occupying a parallel realm that sometimes intersected with ours, capable of deception, of mimicry, of driving humans mad simply by existing in proximity to them. Most were indifferent to humanity. Some were malicious. A few were curious. I read about how they were attracted to places between things, basements and attics, dawn and dusk, the moments between sleeping and waking, liminal spaces where the boundaries weren't quite solid. I read about how they could appear as shadows, as animals, as people you almost recognized, how they could make sounds without sources, how they could make you question your own mind, because that was part of the game, making you doubt, making you wonder, making you unstable enough that the barriers between your world and theirs started to dissolve. I read until my eyes burned, and the words stopped making sense, and then I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, trying to convince myself that every creak and groan was just wood and metal, expanding and contracting with temperature changes. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps above me. Not my cousin. I knew his gait, heavy and deliberate, the sound of someone who didn't worry about waking others. These were different, lighter, more careful, pacing slowly from one end of the room above me to the other, back and forth, in a rhythm that felt wrong, too steady, too measured, like something was counting, matching steps to some internal metronome that humans didn't have. I grabbed my phone. 303. The knocking came then, 3 times, but not from the exterior door, from the door at the top of the stairs, the one that led to the rest of the house. 3 measured knocks, patient and terrible, and above them, the footsteps stopped. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child, which was absurd, which helped nothing. But I did it anyway because some instincts are older than logic. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in the enclosed space, and underneath it, I could hear nothing. No footsteps, no knocking, no sound at all except the water heater in my own terrified heart. When I finally forced myself to lower the blanket and check the time, it was 3:47. 44 minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. The door at the top of the stairs was closed. The house was silent. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except I could smell something. That smell from the backyard, like ozone, like storms, like the air right before lightning strikes. It was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from the corner where I prayed, where I'd seen the figure in the reflection. I left the next morning, told my cousin it was sudden, a job opportunity, a friend with a room to rent. He nodded and didn't ask questions, and his wife packed me food in containers I never returned. As I carried my bags up the basement stairs for the last time, I looked back at the space where I'd spent those months. The door at the bottom of the stairs, the exterior door, was open, just an inch, just enough. I didn't close it. I just left. Sometimes now, in my new place, I wake up at night and check my phone before I fully understand why. The time is rarely 3:03, but I check anyway. I'll be in the middle of something, cooking, reading, talking to someone, and I'll stop, suddenly certain that I'm being watched, that something is standing just out of sight, patient and interested, waiting to see what I'll do next. I don't pray anymore, can't bring myself to kneel, to close my eyes, to put myself in that vulnerable position. Every time I think about it, I remember that figure in the reflection, bowing when I bowed, praying when I prayed, mimicking, learning. My grandmother was right about one thing: the jinn are real. But she was wrong about everything else. They're not malicious or benevolent. They're not even interested in us, not really. We're just something that exists in their peripheral vision, occasionally entertaining, occasionally useful. Like how we might watch ants carrying sugar across a sidewalk, interesting for a moment, then forgotten. Unless we do something to catch their attention. Unless we invite them, knowingly or not, into the spaces where we sleep and pray and exist. Unless we give them a reason to remember us. I think something in that basement remembered me. I think it still does. Sometimes, late at night, I hear 3 measured knocks against my apartment door. I never answer. I don't even check the time anymore. I just lie there in the dark, listening to my own breathing, wondering if the sound is real or if I've brought it with me, internalized it, made it part of my own rhythm, wondering if it even matters anymore what's real and what's not. Because either way, something is still knocking. And either way, I'm still counting. Story 10. The October air smelled of rust and old leaves when we parked at the edge of the forest, 3 miles outside Beacon. I'd never been the superstitious type, never believed in ghosts or cursed ground or any of that nonsense, but standing at the tree line, staring at the path that wound toward the Willowbrook Sanatorium ruins, I felt something coil tight in my stomach. Not fear exactly. More like recognition, as if my body remembered something my mind refused to acknowledge. Deacon went first, his backpack jingling with climbing gear and flashlights. Then Fisher, filming everything on his phone, already narrating for whatever Urbex channel he'd post to later. I followed, hands in my jacket pockets, watching the way the afternoon light fractured through the canopy. The trees here grew differently than they should, twisted at odd angles, their bark pale and papery like dead skin. The sanatorium emerged from the forest like a surfacing corpse. 4 stories of yellow brick, windows dark as missing teeth, ivy consuming the eastern wing in a slow vegetative suffocation. It had closed in 1974, Fisher had told us during the drive, after a series of scandals involving patient treatment and several unexplained incidents. He'd used that word specifically, incidents, as if the details were too gruesome or too vague to name. We entered through a side door hanging from one hinge. The interior darkness was immediate and absolute, swallowing the daylight behind us. Our flashlight beams carved narrow tunnels through the black, illuminating peeling paint, scattered debris, the occasional chair overturned in a hallway. The air tasted stale and mineral, like licking a battery. Every surface wore a film of dust, thick as felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was holding its breath. We moved through the ground floor methodically, documenting the pharmacy with its shattered cabinets, the recreation room with its scattered domino tiles and toppled card tables, the dining hall where long metal tables still stood in crooked rows. Deacon kept making jokes about prison food, trying to lighten the mood, but his voice sounded wrong in this place. Too loud, almost profane, like laughing in a cathedral. Fisher wanted to see the patient wards. He'd read online that the 3rd floor contained the isolation units where they'd kept the most disturbed cases. The stairwell groaned under our weight, each step producing a different pitch, like playing a massive dying instrument. Graffiti marked the walls, the usual tags and obscenities, but also stranger things. Symbols that looked almost deliberate. Names scratched so deeply into the plaster they'd taken hours to carve. The 3rd floor hallway stretched longer than it should have, narrowing at the edges of my vision as if perspective itself had warped. Doors lined both sides, most hanging open on broken hinges. Room after room of the same layout. Metal bed frame bolted to the floor, a small toilet in the corner, barred windows looking out on the forest canopy. Some rooms still contained personal effects. A leather shoe, a comb with hair still tangled in it, a paperback novel swollen with water damage. Fisher was filming everything, muttering commentary about the architecture, the decay, the historical significance. Deacon had grown quieter, his earlier bravado evaporating in the oppressive stillness. I noticed he'd stopped making eye contact with the rooms, keeping his gaze fixed on the hallway ahead. That's when I saw it. In one of the rooms near the end of the corridor, something glinted in the dust. A piece of brass, small and rectangular, partially hidden beneath fallen ceiling tiles. I picked it up without thinking, brushing away decades of grime. Numbers had been stamped into the metal. 47. A ward number, I assumed, or a bed assignment. The brass felt warm in my palm, warmer than it should have after lying in this cold building for half a century. I slipped it into my jacket pocket. The change happened so gradually I almost missed it. Fisher's narration became more erratic, his sentences fragmenting. He started repeating phrases: remarkable state of preservation, remarkable state, remarkable, over and over, his voice taking on a mechanical quality. Then he stopped mid-sentence, lowered his phone, and began walking in circles around a section of hallway. Not pacing, circling, like a dog looking for a place to lie down. Deacon asked him what he was doing, but Fisher didn't respond. He just kept walking that same tight circle, lips moving soundlessly. When I got closer, I realized he was cursing, a steady stream of profanity directed at something only he could see. His eyes were focused on a point in the empty air, tracking movement that wasn't there. The rational part of my brain insisted on explanations: stress, carbon monoxide, delirium from dehydration. But watching Deacon's face as he stared at Fisher, I knew we were thinking the same impossible thing. Deacon suggested we leave. His voice came out too flat, too controlled, and I realized he was trying very hard not to show fear. When Fisher didn't respond or break his circling, Deacon grabbed his arm. Fisher shook him off without looking at him, never breaking stride, never stopping his silent cursing. Then Deacon sat down, just sat, right there in the middle of the hallway, back against the moldering wallpaper. He looked up at me with a smile I'd never seen on his face before, familiar yet foreign, like seeing a loved one's features rearranged by plastic surgery. He started talking about the weather, about a restaurant we'd never been to, about people I'd never met. His tone was conversational, almost cheerful, as if we were old friends catching up after years apart. He asked if I remembered the summer we spent at the lake house, the time we got lost hiking in the Catskills, the night we watched the meteor shower from the observatory deck. None of these things had happened. We'd known each other 3 years, met at a poker game, bonded over a shared love of photography and bourbon. But the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, made me doubt my own memory. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe there was a lake house, a hiking trip, a meteor shower I'd somehow erased from my mind. I told him we needed to go. He nodded agreeably and kept talking, asking if I still had the photos from that wedding we attended, the one where the groom's father gave that terrible toast. He laughed at the memory, a memory that didn't exist, and I felt something crack in my chest, not quite pain, but close. That's when the rage came. It didn't build. It arrived fully formed, cold and methodical, settling over me like a second skin. I looked at the wall of institutional tiles, that sickly green color that seemed designed to drain hope, and wanted to destroy it. Not in a passionate frenzy, but with the calm, systematic approach of someone performing a necessary task. My hands curled into fists, knuckles white, and I could see it so clearly, driving my fists into those tiles, over and over, until I heard something give way. Not just the ceramic breaking, something deeper, something structural. I wanted to hear the building scream. The thought was so alien, so completely unlike me, that it shocked me into stillness. I'd never been a violent person, never thrown a punch, never felt the urge. But standing in that hallway with Fisher circling and Deacon speaking comfortable lies, I understood with perfect clarity that I could break that wall, would break it, and wouldn't stop until my hands were pulp and something behind the tiles cracked open. The brass piece burned in my pocket. Without understanding why, I pulled it out. The warmth had intensified, radiating through my palm, up my arm, spreading through my chest like slow poison. The moment my fingers closed around it, the rage sharpened. I could feel exactly where the wall was weakest, where the mortar had crumbled, where the studs behind would snap with the least resistance. I walked toward it, hand raised. Then I stopped. Some last fragment of rational thought screaming that this wasn't me, this wasn't real. Something was wrong, wrong, wrong. I looked at Deacon, still talking about fabricated memories with that wrong, familiar smile. At Fisher, circling and cursing at empty air. At my own raised fist, trembling with the urge to strike. I ran, down the hallway, down the groaning stairs, through the darkened rooms and out into the twilight. The forest had changed while we were inside. The light had that purple-gray quality that comes just after sunset, though we couldn't have been in there more than 90 minutes. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Behind me I heard Deacon's voice calling my name, but it wasn't quite right. The syllables were correct, but the pronunciation was off, like someone speaking a language they'd only read, never heard. I didn't look back. The brass piece was still in my hand, still burning. I stumbled across the overgrown lawn toward the perimeter fence, mind racing through explanations that made no sense. Gas leak, mass psychosis, some kind of hallucinogenic mold growing in the walls. But none of it explained the specific nature of our afflictions, the targeted precision of whatever had infected us. At the fence line I stopped. My hand was cramping around the brass, fingers locked. The rage had followed me outside, had gotten stronger if anything. I could feel it pushing against the inside of my skull, insisting I turn around, go back, finish what I'd started, break the wall, hear what lies behind it. But I also felt something else, a desperate animal need to get rid of the thing in my hand. I pried my fingers open. The brass had left an imprint on my palm, the number 47 pressed into my skin like a brand. I walked back toward the building, staying in the open field, and stopped at the section of fence closest to the entrance. An old gate hung there, padlocked and rusted, vertical bars spaced 6 inches apart. I pushed the brass piece between the bars, felt it drop into the dead leaves on the other side. The moment it left my hand, the rage drained away so quickly I staggered. The sudden absence left me hollow, shaking, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I noticed the moonlight. It had been clear when we arrived, but now clouds covered half the sky, thick and moving fast. The moon appeared and disappeared behind them, its light shifting in quality, sometimes silver-white, sometimes with a yellowish tinge. As I stood there, watching, it changed again. For just a second, maybe less, the light turned a deep amber, like stage lighting through a colored gel. The whole forest transformed. Every shadow deepened. Every surface took on a sepia tone. Then it snapped back to silver white. I heard footsteps behind me. Deacon and Fisher emerged from the building, moving normally now, though they looked exhausted. Fisher had stopped filming. Deacon had stopped smiling that wrong smile. They stared at me, confused, as if waking from a dream they couldn't quite remember. Deacon asked how long we'd been inside. Fisher checked his phone and swore. 3 hours had passed, though it had felt like 90 minutes at most. We compared memories of what had happened, each of us offering fragments. Deacon remembered sitting down, but not why. Fisher remembered walking, but couldn't explain what he'd been looking for. I told them about the brass piece, about the rage, about returning it to the fence. None of us mentioned going back to get it. We drove home in silence, arriving just after midnight. I showered for 40 minutes, trying to scrub away the feeling of that building's air on my skin, the phantom warmth of the brass in my palm. When I finally looked at my hand, the imprint was still there, faint but visible. The number 47, backwards now, like a mirror image, like the building had marked me as its own. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hallway, those green tiles, and felt the methodical urge to destroy them. Not from anger, but from something colder. The certainty that breaking them was necessary, that something on the other side needed to be released or exposed or witnessed. 3 days later, Deacon called. He'd been having dreams about a lake house that doesn't exist, about memories he knows are false but can't stop believing. They feel more real than his actual childhood, he said. Sometimes he wakes up confused about which memories are genuine. Fisher hasn't posted any of the footage to his Urbex channel. When I asked him why, he said the video is corrupted, not technically, but wrong. In every frame, There are shapes in the background that weren't there when we filmed it. Figures standing in doorways, faces in the windows. And in one shot, just before we found the brass piece, you can see me reaching for it, but my reflection in the window behind is doing something different. My reflection is smiling. I still have the mark on my palm. It's fading slowly, but at night, in certain light, it seems to darken instead. Sometimes I catch myself running my thumb over it, tracing the numbers. And when I do, I remember exactly where that wall is, exactly how it would feel to break it open, exactly what sound it would make. The other day, I looked up Willowbrook Sanatorium's patient records. Most have been sealed or destroyed, but some fragments exist in county archives. I found a reference to Ward 47, the isolation unit where they kept patients exhibiting violent delusions and dissociative episodes. The ward was closed in 1968 after a series of incidents the records don't detail. The brass ward markers were removed and supposedly destroyed, but one must have survived, hidden under ceiling tiles for 50 years, waiting. I haven't told Deacon or Fisher what I've learned, or about the other thing I discovered. The records include photographs of some patients, and in one image from 1967, there's a man standing in the Ward 47 hallway. The photo is overexposed and blurry, taken from a distance, but I can see his posture, the shape of his shoulders, the way he holds his hands. He looks exactly like me. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. I've checked my birth certificate, my parents' records, every document that proves I was born in 1989, 22 years after that photo was taken. Everything confirms I couldn't possibly be that man. But I've also started having my own false memories now, of a lake house, of hiking trips, of a meteor shower watched from an observatory that doesn't exist. And sometimes late at night I remember being in Ward 47, not visiting it, being there, as a patient. I remember the cold floor, the barred windows, the sound of my own voice cursing at things that weren't there, the methodical rage that filled every moment, the need to break something, anything, to hear what lay behind. The brass piece is still at the fence in the dead leaves. I know exactly where it is. I could walk there in the dark, reach through the bars, find it in seconds. Some nights I think about going back. Some nights, I'm not sure I ever left. Story 11. The stone walls absorbed sound the way deep water swallows light. That's what I noticed first about the cabin, how noise seemed to die the moment it left my mouth, as if the house itself consumed every word, every footstep, every breath before it could fully exist in the air. I'd bought the place in late October, signing the papers in a Burlington law office, where the attorney had barely looked at me. The realtor, an older woman with hands that trembled slightly when she passed me the keys, mentioned something about the previous owner having left suddenly. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I was looking for isolation, for a place where I could spend the winter months working on my manuscript without interruption. The cabin in Manchester, nestled between the Green Mountains with stone walls 2 feet thick, seemed perfect. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and arranging my workspace. I set up my desk facing the large window that overlooked the forest, organized my books on the built-in shelves, and familiarized myself with the quirks of an old house, the way the pipes groaned in the morning, how the floorboards in the hallway settled at night, the particular rattle of the window frames when wind came down from the mountains. It was on the 8th night that I heard it. I'd been carrying a stack of notebooks up to the 2nd floor when a voice drifted from somewhere above me on the staircase. Just one word, barely louder than a breath. George. I froze mid-step, my heart suddenly loud in my ears. The sound had been so close it felt like someone had whispered directly beside my head, but the stairwell was narrow, and I would have seen anyone standing there. I looked up into the shadows of the 2nd floor landing, then back down toward the living room. Nothing. The house held its familiar silence, that peculiar dead quality to the air. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps some acoustic trick of the old stone walls. Houses like these carried sounds in strange ways. I continued up the stairs, but my hands weren't quite steady as I set the notebooks down. The next morning, I found the silverware. I'd gone downstairs for coffee, still half asleep, and there they were. 3 forks, 2 knives, and a spoon, arranged in a perfect line along the kitchen windowsill. The cutlery caught the early light, each piece evenly spaced, as if someone had measured the distance between them with meticulous care. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, coffee forgotten. I lived alone. I was certain I'd put all the silverware in the drawer the night before. I remembered doing it specifically, remembered the clink of metal against metal as I dropped them into their compartments. Yet here they were, displayed like artifacts in a museum. Perhaps I'd been more tired than I thought. Perhaps I'd arranged them there myself, and simply didn't remember. The mind does strange things when you're adjusting to a new place, to solitude, to the particular silence of a house buried in the Vermont woods. I put the silverware back in the drawer and tried to focus on my writing. The door became the next concern. The back door, which led out to a small porch and the woodshed beyond, developed a peculiar resistance. Each time I tried to close it, the latch wouldn't catch on the first attempt. I'd push it shut, hear the click that should have meant it was secured, but when I tested the handle, it would swing open. Only on the second try, always on the second try, would it actually lock into place. At first, I thought the doorframe had warped with age or humidity. I checked the alignment, examined the strike plate, even tried tightening the screws. Everything appeared fine. The door fit perfectly in its frame, yet the behavior persisted. First attempt, failure, second attempt, success. Every single time. It began to feel less like a mechanical problem and more like a ritual, as if the door needed that first test, that initial rejection, before it would consent to close properly. I started avoiding the back door when I could. The trip to the market came on a Thursday. I needed supplies: coffee, bread, eggs, the basics that sustain solitary winter living. The grocery store in town was small, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where my unfamiliar face drew quick glances before people returned to their conversations. The cashier was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She scanned my items with the efficiency of someone who'd done this job for decades. Then, as she was bagging the bread, she paused and looked at me directly for the first time. Did I buy the house over on Meadowbrook Road? She wanted to know. The old stone place. I confirmed that I had, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite concern, not quite pity, but somewhere in between. She asked if I'd bought the house that belonged to George. The name hit me like cold water. I found myself asking who George was, trying to keep my voice casual, trying not to reveal the sudden tightness in my chest. She just shook her head and told me to have a nice day, but her eyes held something I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, maybe, or warning. I drove back to the cabin with my groceries and the name echoing in my mind. George, the same name I'd heard whispered on the stairs. I tried to remember if the realtor or the attorney had mentioned the previous owner's name, but I couldn't recall it being spoken aloud. The papers had likely listed it, but I hadn't paid attention to such details at the time. That night I did something I can't fully explain. After I'd finished my evening routine, after I'd locked all the doors and turned off most of the lights, I stood at the base of the staircase and spoke into the darkness of the second floor. I said goodnight to George. The response was immediate. 2 distinct creaks came from the living room, from the section of floor near the fireplace. Not the random settling of old wood, but 2 deliberate sounds, spaced exactly apart like footsteps, or like someone responding. I turned to look at the living room, my mouth suddenly dry. The shadows there seemed thicker than they should have been, even in the dim light from the hallway. I walked slowly toward the sound, my heart hammering, but there was nothing to see. Just my furniture, my books, my things occupying a space that suddenly felt less like mine than I'd thought. Then I noticed the clock on the wall, an old piece that had come with the house, something I'd meant to replace but hadn't gotten around to. The minute hand had moved. It was now 11:46 instead of 11:45, but I'd heard no tick to mark the passage of time. The clock had simply advanced 1 minute while I wasn't looking, as if time itself had skipped forward by some invisible hand. I began researching the house's history after that. The local library had property records going back over a century, and I spent an afternoon in their musty basement archives, pulling files and scanning through deed transfers. The cabin had changed hands several times, but one name appeared more frequently than others in the records from the 1960s through the 1990s. George Whitmore. There was a newspaper clipping from 1992, just a small article about a local man who'd lived alone in the mountains for 30 years. George Whitmore, the piece said, was known in town as a quiet man who kept to himself, who'd moved to Manchester after some unspecified trouble elsewhere. The article had been written while he was still alive, a human interest piece about solitary living in rural Vermont. I couldn't find any record of his death. No obituary, no death certificate in the county records. The property had been transferred to a trust, then sold to another owner, then eventually to me. But what had happened to George himself remained unclear. The events escalated after I learned his full name. The silverware returned to the windowsill almost daily now. I'd put it away, and the next morning it would be back, arranged in that same precise line. I stopped bothering to move it after a while. Let it stay there, I thought. What harm was it doing? The whispering on the stairs grew more frequent. Sometimes I heard it multiple times a day, that same soft pronunciation of the name, always when I was alone, always when I was moving between floors. I began to feel watched in my own home, as if invisible eyes tracked my movements from room to room. The back door required its double closing every time without fail. I started to think of it as asking permission, the first attempt being a request, the second being the actual entry. And every night, after I said goodnight to George, the floorboards creaked twice in the living room, and the clock advanced 1 minute without ticking. I should have left. A rational person would have packed up and driven back to Boston, would have put the house on the market and cut their losses. But something kept me there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe, and this is the thought that's hardest to face, maybe it was the growing sense that leaving wasn't actually an option anymore. Because the longer I stayed, the more the house felt like it was training me, teaching me its rituals. The silverware on the windowsill, the double closing of the door, the nightly greeting to someone who may or may not exist. These weren't just quirks or supernatural events. They were patterns being imposed, expectations being established. I began to notice other things. The coffee mug I used every morning was always sitting on the counter when I came downstairs, even though I was certain I'd put it in the cupboard the night before. My reading glasses, which I had a habit of leaving on my desk, would appear on the arm of the living room chair. Small displacements, as if someone else was living in the house with me, using my things, moving them according to their own preferences. The manuscript I'd come here to write sat untouched for days. I couldn't focus on fiction when my own reality had become so uncertain. Instead, I found myself spending hours just sitting in the living room waiting. For what, I couldn't say. A confrontation? An explanation? Some final revelation that would make sense of everything? One night, about a month after I'd moved in, I broke the routine. When it came time to say goodnight, I remained silent. I stood at the base of the stairs and deliberately said nothing, waiting to see what would happen. The house seemed to hold its breath along with me. The usual background sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the radiators, the whisper of wind against the windows, all seemed to fade into a profound silence. Then the smell hit me. Pipe tobacco, the rich, sweet scent of it, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps it had been subtle enough that I dismissed it as imagination, but now it was unmistakable, filling the downstairs with the ghost of someone's habit. I finally spoke, my voice hoarse. "Good night, George." The creaks came from the living room as always. 2 of them, but this time they were slower, more deliberate. And the clock didn't just advance 1 minute, it advanced 3, jumping from 11:43 to 11:46, in complete silence. I understood then, or thought I understood. This was what happened when you broke the pattern. This was the consequence of disrupting the established ritual. The house, or George, or whatever presence inhabited this place, was showing me what would happen if I stopped cooperating. The question that haunts me now, that keeps me awake long after I've said my nightly greeting is this. Am I the one who's being haunted, or am I the one who's become the ghost? Because lately I've noticed that when I go into town, people look through me more than at me. The cashier at the market doesn't ask about the house anymore. She rings up my groceries without seeming to see me at all. The librarian who used to chat about local history now passes by as if I'm not there. And yesterday, when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I could have sworn I saw someone else standing behind me. Just for a second. Just long enough to notice that he looked like he belonged in the house more than I did. Tonight I'll say goodnight to George as I always do. The floorboards will creak. The clock will advance. The silverware will wait for me on the windowsill in the morning. But I'm starting to wonder whose routine I'm following. Whose life I'm living in this stone house that absorbs sound like deep water swallows light. And whether George ever really left at all, or if he's been here the whole time, watching as I slowly become him, one ritual at a time, one disappeared moment at a time, until eventually someone else will move into this cabin and hear a different name whispered on the stairs. Mine. Story 12. The first time I noticed Elliot, I was 7 years old, standing in the kitchen of our Savannah house while my mother searched frantically through every drawer. She needed the good scissors, the heavy German ones with black handles that could cut through cardboard and denim with equal ease. They'd vanished 3 days earlier, along with her favorite paring knife and the cleaver she used for chicken. I remember the way her hands trembled as she slammed the last drawer shut, the sound echoing through the tall ceilinged room with its peeling yellow wallpaper. That's when I felt it for the first time. A presence, warm and patient, standing just behind my left shoulder. Not threatening, almost protective. The air there felt thicker somehow, like humidity before a storm, and I could have sworn I heard breathing that wasn't mine, steady and calm while my mother's grew more frantic. 2 months later, she found all 3 implements arranged in a perfect row behind the hot water heater in the basement, gleaming clean despite the dust that coated everything else down there. She never questioned it, just muttered about her own forgetfulness and carried them back upstairs. But I knew. Something in that house moved things, organized them, waited. I started calling him Elliot after a character in a book I'd been reading, some adventure story I can't even remember now. The name felt right, solid and dependable. Over the years, I learned Elliot's patterns. Sharp objects would disappear when they'd been left out carelessly, only to resurface later, always clean, always organized. Once, when I was 12, I'd been using my father's box cutter to open a stubborn package and left it on my desk, blade extended. The next morning, it was gone. I found it 3 weeks later with all the kitchen knives, blade retracted and safe. My parents never acknowledged anything unusual about our house. They attributed missing items to their own absent-mindedness, the reappearances to finding things they'd misplaced and forgotten about. But I knew better. I felt Elliot in the spaces between sounds, in the way certain floorboards never creaked under invisible weight, in the subtle shifts of air when I walked through doorways. When I moved out at 24, I didn't expect Elliot to follow. My new apartment was a cramped third-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian on the east side of town, all exposed brick and drafty windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, tried to feel like an adult living independently for the first time. The place felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the sparse furnishings, a hollow emptiness, like a held breath. Then came the day I returned from the grocery store, arms loaded with paper bags threatening to split. I'd left the door slightly ajar while I fished for my keys, and as I pushed it open with my hip, it swung shut behind me with a soft, decisive click. The lock engaged with a sound like a tongue clicking against teeth. I stood there in the narrow entryway, bags cutting circulation to my fingers, and felt that familiar thickness in the air, the warmth, the presence just behind my left shoulder, patient and watchful. "Elliot?" I said it quietly, almost embarrassed by the sound of my own voice in the silent apartment. The overhead light dimmed for just a moment, a brief brownout that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. When it brightened again, my hands were shaking. After that, the occurrences became more frequent. I'd leave the oven on after making dinner, only to find it cold and switched off when I remembered with a jolt of panic an hour later. My phone would appear on the coffee table charging when I could have sworn I'd left it in the bedroom with the battery dying. Once I spent an entire morning searching for a parking ticket I needed to pay, tearing through drawers and coat pockets, only to find it that evening folded neatly on the kitchen counter, weighted down by my coffee mug, which I distinctly remembered washing and putting away that morning. I should have felt grateful. These were helpful interventions, weren't they? The actions of something that cared about my well-being, that wanted to keep me safe and organized. I told myself that constantly, especially late at night when I lay awake listening to the apartment settle around me. Those old building sounds that could be anything or nothing. But there was something else growing alongside the gratitude, spreading like mold in the spaces I didn't want to examine too closely. A creeping awareness that Elliot's help came with a price I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice. It started with the sensation of being watched, not occasionally, but constantly. Every moment I spent in the apartment felt observed, documented, cataloged by an intelligence I couldn't see or understand. I'd catch myself performing ordinary tasks, making coffee, folding laundry, showering, with an acute self-consciousness, as if I were always on stage for an audience of one. The feeling intensified over the following weeks. I began to notice patterns in Elliot's interventions that seemed less about helping and more about what? Control? Correction? The knife block on my counter was always arranged in perfect order, largest to smallest, regardless of how I'd put them away. My shoes by the door were consistently realigned, so they faced the wall at precise 45-degree angles. Books I'd left open face down would be carefully bookmarked and closed, as if my casual reading habits offended some invisible sense of order. Then there was the incident with the letter from Vivienne. Vivienne was someone I'd been avoiding calling for weeks, an ex-girlfriend who'd left increasingly desperate voicemails about needing to talk about something important. I'd let the messages pile up, deleted them eventually without listening to most, and buried the letter she'd sent under a stack of junk mail because I wasn't ready for whatever conversation she needed to have. I came home one evening to find the letter placed in the exact center of the kitchen counter, creased sharply down the middle where it had been folded. My coffee mug sat on top of it, and when I lifted the mug, I saw that condensation had formed a perfect ring on the paper. The wet circle encompassed only one thing: Vivienne's name in the return address. The precision of it made something cold crawl down my spine. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Elliot hadn't just found something I'd lost. He'd gone through my mail, identified what I was avoiding, and presented it to me in a way that felt less like help and more like a command. I picked up the phone and called Vivienne. The entire conversation I felt Elliot there, that warm presence now seeming to press against my back rather than hover beside my shoulder. The air in the apartment felt dense, hard to breathe, and I found myself whispering without meaning to, as if speaking too loudly might provoke something. Vivienne's voice sounded distant and strange, and I couldn't focus on what she was saying. Something about needing closure, about seeing me one last time. I agreed to meet her just to end the call. After I hung up, I sat in the dark living room for a long time, listening to the building breathe around me. That's when I started to wonder, had Elliot always been helpful, or had I just been interpreting his actions that way because I wanted to believe someone was looking out for me? The thought, once planted, grew roots. I began paying closer attention to the specifics of Elliot's interventions. The oven wasn't just being turned off when I forgot. It was being turned off precisely 20 minutes after I'd stopped using it, as if something had been timing me, learning my patterns. The phone wasn't just charging when the battery was low. It was being moved from wherever I'd left it to the exact same spot on the coffee table, always positioned at the same angle. And the knives. God, the knives. They'd always disappeared when left out, reappearing later with the others. But now I noticed they were being taken even when put away properly, vanishing from the knife block overnight, only to return the next evening arranged in a slightly different order, as if something were cataloging them, studying them, deciding which ones it preferred. I stopped thanking Elliot after that realization hit me. For years, I developed the habit of saying, "Thanks, Elliot," whenever I noticed his interventions, and the lights would do that brief dim in acknowledgement. But now the idea of communicating with whatever shared this space made my throat close up. I wanted to pretend it wasn't there, that I lived alone like any normal person. That lasted 3 days. On the third night of silence, I woke at 3:47 a.m. to every light in the apartment blazing. The brightness was painful after the darkness, and I squinted against it, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The lights pulsed. Bright, dim, bright, dim, in a rhythm that felt like urgency, like demand. I understood the message. Elliot wanted acknowledgement, needed it, perhaps, and I'd withdrawn the only thing I'd ever given him. "Okay," I said to the empty bedroom, voice hoarse with sleep and fear. "Okay, Elliot, I'm sorry." The light stabilized immediately, then dimmed to normal levels. In the sudden return to darkness, I saw spots floating across my vision. The air felt heavier than ever, that presence now seeming to fill the entire apartment rather than just hovering at my shoulder. It pressed against every surface, every corner, and I realized with a clarity that made me nauseous that I'd never been alone here, not for a single moment. Sleep didn't come again that night. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds I'd never noticed before. The whisper of air moving through rooms with no open windows, the soft friction of something brushing against walls, the barely audible creak of floorboards under weight that couldn't exist. The next morning, exhausted and jittery with too much caffeine, I did something I'd never thought to do before. I started researching the history of my apartment building. The old Victorian had been converted to apartments in the 1980s, but before that it had been a boarding house, and before that a private residence built in 1892. The original owner's name was Theodore Elliott Hartwell. He'd been a collector of surgical instruments, a physician by trade who'd maintained a private practice in the house's front parlor. I found an obituary from 1924, yellow and brittle in the digital archive. Theodore Elliott Hartwell had died in the house at age 57, cause of death listed as nervous exhaustion. The obituary mentioned his meticulous nature, his insistence on order and precision, his dedication to helping others. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my coffee mug before I spilled it. The mug left a ring on the desk, and I watched, transfixed, as that wet circle slowly evaporated, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. That evening, I started noticing other things. The way my clothes were always hanging in the closet organized by color, even though I never did that. The way my books were alphabetized on their shelf despite my deliberately scrambling them. The way everything in the apartment seemed to shift slightly whenever I left and returned, as if it had been examined and put back not quite right. I thought about Theodore Elliott Hartwell's surgical instruments, about sharp objects disappearing and reappearing clean, about helpful interventions that might not be help at all, but something else, something with its own agenda, its own needs, its own idea of how things should be arranged. I stood in my kitchen as darkness fell outside, looking at the knife block with its precisely ordered blades, and I understood finally what had been happening all these years. The question wasn't whether Elliot was real or whether I was losing my mind. The question was much worse than that. What had I invited in when I'd given it a name? What had I been feeding with years of gratitude and acknowledgement? And most terrifying of all, whose standards of order was I now expected to meet? Behind me, I felt that presence press closer than it ever had before, warm and patient and utterly inescapable. The air grew thick enough that breathing required conscious effort. On the counter, my phone lit up with a notification, though I'd turned off all alerts hours ago. The screen showed a reminder I hadn't created. Meet Vivian tomorrow, don't forget. E. I'd never mentioned the day we'd agreed to meet. I'd never written it down anywhere. The lights dimmed once, briefly, and in that moment of reduced visibility, I could have sworn I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shape, tall and thin, with too many angles to be human. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing. Only the sense of something waiting, something that had been waiting in corners and behind shoulders for over a century, helping and organizing and quietly, patiently, making everything exactly as it believed things should be. "Thank you, Elliot," I whispered, because what else could I do? The lights dimmed again, and this time they seemed to pulse with something that might have been satisfaction. That night I locked my bedroom door for the first time since moving in, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Elliot had never needed doors. In the darkness, I listened to the apartment rearrange itself around me. Subtle sounds of objects being moved, adjusted, perfected. The doorknob to my room turned slowly, testing, and though the lock held, I understood that it held only because Elliot allowed it to. I live with that understanding now. Every day I come home to an apartment more organized than I left it, to helpful interventions I never requested, to the constant weight of invisible attention. I thank Elliot regularly, watch the lights dim in acknowledgement, and try not to think about what might happen if I stopped. Try not to wonder what standards I'm failing to meet, what corrections are being planned, what Theodore Eliot Hartwell's vision of help and order ultimately requires. Sometimes, late at night, I think about moving again, finding a new place, starting over, leaving Elliot behind in this drafty Victorian apartment. But then I remember Savannah, remember that childhood house where it all began, and I understand the truth I've been avoiding. Elliot didn't follow me here. Elliot was always here, waiting. I was the one who went looking for him. Story 13. The iron touched my shirt collar with a hiss, and I paused, listening to the silence settle back over the monastery like sediment in disturbed water. This was my 4th night at the Benedictine retreat in the New Mexico desert, and I still wasn't used to how completely sound died here. Not muffled, died. As if the adobe walls absorbed every vibration, every whisper of wind, leaving behind a vacuum that pressed against my eardrums. I'd come here to reset something broken in my head, though I couldn't have named what. The brothers didn't ask. That was the beauty of their hospitality. They offered shelter without demanding explanation, routine without interrogation, lauds at dawn, work in the garden, communal meals eaten in silence punctuated only by scripture readings, vespers at dusk, compline before bed. The rhythm was supposed to be meditative, transformative even. Instead, I felt myself becoming increasingly aware of the spaces between the prayers, the gaps where my thoughts writhed like something trying to surface from deep water. The laundry room occupied a corner of the basement, accessible by stone steps that predated the modern additions to the monastery by at least a century. I'd waited until after Compline to iron my shirt for tomorrow, vanity perhaps, in a place dedicated to its absence, but old habits die hard. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. I'd folded my slacks and was reaching for the iron's cord when my foot slipped. The floor had become a mirror. Water sheeted across the terracotta tiles, moving with purpose down the slight gradient of the corridor. Not pooling, flowing. I caught myself on the ironing board, heart suddenly loud in my throat, and watched the water lap at the baseboards with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. The overhead lights fractured across its surface, creating the illusion of depth, as if the floor had been replaced by something bottomless. For a moment I could only stare, my mind struggling to contextualize what I was seeing. The silence remained absolute. No sound of rushing water, no drip of a leak. Just the visual fact of it, spreading with inexorable calm. I found my voice, though it emerged smaller than I'd intended. The monks would be in their cells by now, observing the great silence until morning prayers. Disturbing them felt like a violation, but leaving this unattended felt worse. I unplugged the iron with shaking hands and ventured into the corridor, my shoes creating small disturbances in the water that radiated outward in perfect circles. The basement stretched farther than I'd realized, its ceiling supported by rounded arches that created pocket after pocket of shadow. The water seemed to originate from somewhere deeper in the complex, beyond the reach of the few bulbs that still burned. I should have gone upstairs, I knew, should have knocked on doors, raised the alarm. But something held me in place, a growing certainty that if I looked away, If I left now, I would miss understanding something essential. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from ahead, from the darkness where the corridor bent around a corner I'd never explored. Not hurried, not alarmed, just the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going, accompanied by the soft splash of water displaced by feet. I froze, torn between relief and something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand rigid. The figure that emerged into the sphere of light was Brother Anselm, one of the older monks I'd seen at prayers but never spoken to. He moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age, his white beard catching the fluorescent glow, his face creased with confusion rather than concern. He saw me and paused, blinking as if surprised to find another person in this subterranean place. He explained, in a voice like dry leaves, that he'd received a telephone call. The maintenance supervisor had contacted him. Brother Anselm served as the informal liaison for building issues, asking him to check on a leak in the basement. The old monk had dressed and descended immediately, though he confessed he couldn't remember which extension had rung. His cell, perhaps, or the one in the hallway near the chapel. The explanation should have been reassuring. Instead, it raised the fine hairs on my neck. I'd been in the basement for at least 20 minutes. If there'd been a phone call, if someone had known about the water, why had no one arrived sooner? And why call an elderly monk after Compline when the maintenance supervisor lived on site? We found the supervisor together, wading through ankle-deep water to reach his small apartment at the far end of the basement level. He answered our knock wearing a bathrobe, his eyes thick with sleep, and listened to our explanation with growing bewilderment. He hadn't called anyone, he insisted. Hadn't even known about the water until we'd woken him. His phone, when he checked it, showed no outgoing calls. More than that, his extension had been disconnected 3 days ago due to line damage, awaiting repair. The three of us stood in that narrow hallway, water pulling at our ankles, and no one spoke for a long moment. The supervisor moved first, sloshing toward the mechanical room where the main shutoffs lived. Brother Anselm remained still, his watery eyes fixed on something over my shoulder. When I turned to look, there was only darkness and the sound of water continuing its patient advance. The supervisor found the source, a corroded valve that had finally surrendered to time and pressure. As he worked to close it, Brother Anselm and I retrieved mops and squeegees from a storage closet. We worked in silence, the great silence having reasserted its authority over us, but I couldn't stop glancing at the old monk. His confusion had given way to something else, something that looked like recognition. By the time we'd contained the worst of it, pushed the water toward drains, and laid down towels to mark the wet areas, my hands were trembling from more than cold. The supervisor promised to finish in the morning, urged us to get some sleep. Brother Anselm thanked him with a slight bow and turned toward the stairs. I followed, because I couldn't imagine descending into sleep alone with the questions multiplying in my mind. At the top of the stairs, where a single candle burned in its red glass before an icon of Saint Benedict, the old monk paused. He looked at me with eyes that held too much awareness, too much acceptance of something I couldn't yet see. He said, very quietly, that he'd been at this monastery for 47 years. In that time, he'd witnessed 3 incidents like tonight. Different specifics, same pattern. Someone would receive a warning, a call, a knock, a whispered word in a corridor, about a problem that required immediate attention. The warning would prove accurate. The source would prove impossible to trace. I asked him what he thought it meant, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Brother Anselm considered the question with the patience of someone who'd spent decades in contemplation. Finally, he suggested that perhaps the monastery was older than any records indicated. Perhaps it had been a place of prayer and refuge long before the Benedictines arrived, built on ground where the barrier between what we see and what we don't see had worn thin. Not ghosts exactly, not anything so simple. Just a place where help sometimes came from sources we couldn't name, in ways we couldn't explain, when it was needed most. The ceramic tiles in that corridor were smooth as glass when wet. If I'd walked through 15 minutes earlier, if Brother Anselm hadn't arrived when he did, one of us would have fallen. Probably cracked our skull, maybe worse. The thought sat in my stomach like a stone. I thanked the old monk, though the words felt inadequate. He nodded and shuffled toward his cell, leaving me alone with the guttering candle and the weight of his revelation. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat on the narrow bed in my guest cell and listened to the monastery breathe around me, because that's what it sounded like once you started paying attention, not silence, but breath. The expansion and contraction of old wood, the settling of stone, the whisper of air through corridors that had existed long before I'd arrived, and would exist long after I'd gone. At some point in those dark hours, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow, measured, accompanied by a sound like rosary beads clicking against a habit. They passed my door without pausing, faded toward the chapel. When I finally worked up the courage to open my door and look, the corridor was empty. The candle before St. Benedict's icon still burned, its flame perfectly still despite the draft I could feel on my face. The next morning at Lauds, I studied the faces of the monks gathered in their choir stalls. Brother Anselm was there, his voice joining the others in the ancient hymns, his expression serene. The maintenance supervisor sat 3 rows back, his presence a reminder that this was a working monastery, not a museum piece. Everything appeared normal, explicable, firmly rooted in the physical world. But I kept thinking about that phone call, about the specific timing of it, about how if you wanted to warn someone about a danger they couldn't yet see, and you had no physical means of doing so, you might use the tools available. A disconnected phone that rang anyway, a voice that sounded like someone familiar, a message delivered at precisely the right moment to prevent harm. After breakfast, oatmeal and strong coffee taken in continued silence, I found myself drawn back to the basement. Daylight filtered through small windows set high in the walls, revealing details I'd missed in the night. The corridor where the water had flowed was old, much older than the newer wings of the monastery. The stones in the walls bore marks I couldn't interpret. Not quite writing, not quite decoration. They had the look of something that had meaning once, to people whose names were lost to time. I stood there, running my fingers over those ancient marks, and felt the silence press close again. Not oppressive exactly, more like attentive. Like the building was aware of my presence, measuring my intentions. I thought about the 3 other incidents Brother Anselm had mentioned. Different details, same pattern. Warnings that saved lives. Help from sources that couldn't exist. Who had lived here before the Benedictines? What prayers had been offered? What rituals observed? And if those earlier inhabitants had believed this ground was special, had treated it with the reverence due to a thin place, might something have persisted? Not a ghost, not a guardian angel. Something else. Something that paid attention and, when the need was great enough, acted. I should have been terrified. That's what any rational person would have felt, confronted with evidence that reality had more floors than the ones we can see. Instead, I felt something closer to awe. And underneath that, a growing unease that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with a simpler question. If something in this place had saved me last night, what did it want in return? That question followed me through the rest of my stay. During silent meals, I felt eyes on the back of my neck, though when I turned, I saw only other monks bent over their plates. During work hours in the garden, I heard my name whispered by the wind, though no one was close enough to have spoken. At night, the footsteps outside my door became a regular occurrence, always at the same time, always fading toward the chapel. On my final evening, I attended Compline one last time. The monks' voices rose and fell in the ancient plain song, and I tried to focus on the words, on the familiar rhythms of the closing prayer. But my attention kept drifting to the shadows in the corners of the chapel, to the way the candlelight seemed to move in patterns that had nothing to do with air currents. As we filed out afterward, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Brother Anselm stood beside me, his expression gentle but serious. He asked if I'd felt it, the attention of the place. I nodded, because lying seemed pointless. He told me, with the certainty of someone who'd made his peace with mystery, that some people were noticed by places like this, that the monastery remembered those it helped, and sometimes It called them back. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the great silence had fallen, and he was already moving away, his white beard luminous in the candlelight. I left the next morning after lauds, my small bag packed, my shirt neatly ironed. As I walked to my car through the desert dawn, I looked back at the monastery one last time. It stood solid and ancient against the pale sky, its adobe walls glowing pink in the early light. Beautiful, peaceful, and in some fundamental way I couldn't articulate, aware. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've tried to return to my life, my work, my routines. But something has changed. I notice things now that I didn't before. The way certain buildings seem to hum with more than electricity. The way some rooms feel occupied even when they're empty. The way help sometimes arrives from sources I can't explain, in moments when I need it most. And late at night, when sleep eludes me, I hear footsteps in my apartment. Slow, measured, accompanied by a sound like rosary beads clicking. They pass my bedroom door without pausing, fade toward the living room where I keep a candle burning before a small icon I bought in the monastery gift shop. I've stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to convince myself it's tinnitus, or old pipes, or the building settling. Because I know better now. I know that some places remember, some places watch, and some places, having offered their protection once, don't easily let go of those they've chosen to shelter. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether it's real. It's whether I'm grateful or terrified. Whether being noticed by something older and stranger than myself is a blessing or a burden I'll carry until I return to that monastery. Because I will return. I know that now. Can feel the pull of it like a tide I can't resist. And finish whatever conversation began in that flooded basement corridor. Sometimes I catch myself thanking something in a whisper, my voice small in the darkness. And sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I think I hear an answer. Not words, exactly. Just a sense of acknowledgement, of attention that never wavers, of being seen by something that has been watching for a very, very long time. The monks have a word for it I learned later. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that is both terrifying and fascinating. The divine presence that draws you close even as it makes you tremble. I understand it now, in a way I never could have before that night in the basement. And as I sit here in my apartment, listening to footsteps that shouldn't exist, feeling the weight of attention from something I can't name, I realize I've been given a choice I never asked for. Accept this new reality, this awareness of layers beneath the visible world, or spend the rest of my life trying to convince myself I imagined it all. The footsteps pause outside my door. In the living room, the candle flame bends, though there's no draft. I close my eyes and breathe in the silence, and the silence breathes back. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, in a monastery built on ground where the barrier between worlds has worn thin, an old monk kneels in his cell and prays for souls like mine. Noticed, remembered, irrevocably changed by forces we can acknowledge but never truly understand. The phone on my nightstand rings. When I pick it up, the line is dead. Has been dead since I forgot to pay the bill 2 weeks ago. But through the static, I hear something. Not quite a voice. Not quite silence. A warning or an invitation. I'm already packing my bag.